On the night that Aegon IV lay dying, he committed the most destructive act of his 12-year reign, and his reign had already contained many. He legitimized his bastards, every acknowledged one, every name that could be attached to his long and varied history of desire and carelessness. The Maesters who kept the Citadel's records counted 9 great bastards and declined to speculate beyond that, though the true number was certainly higher. In a single rasped command delivered from a bedchamber that smelled of medicines and old wine and the particular staleness of rooms that have held a dying person for a long time, Aegon IV unmade the clean line of Targaryen succession and planted a seed of civil war so deep in the soil of the Seven Kingdoms that it would take nearly 100 years of rebellion and slaughter to finally exhaust it. Let your breathing slow. There is nothing you need to be carrying in this hour. Whatever weight the day required of you can set itself down at the edge of this darkness, and it will still be there in the morning, patient and unchanged, if you find you need it. What waits for you here is far older and far quieter than anything the day left behind, a story that has been sleeping in the records of the Citadel for 8 centuries, cool and still, waiting for a voice to draw it forward. Let the room settle around you. Let your body find its heaviness against whatever is beneath you. We are going back a very long way tonight, through ages of fire and blood and the peculiar arithmetic of royal bloodlines, to find the roots of a conflict that should not have happened and perhaps could not have been prevented. Aegon IV is remembered by the name the Unworthy, and it is worth sitting with that word before moving deeper into his story. Not the cruel, not the dissolute, though the case for both could be made at length and with ample evidence. The chroniclers of the Citadel, who weighed their words with the care of men who understood that words outlast kingdoms, reached for the most final and complete condemnation available to them and settled on unworthy, as if every other epithet was merely a symptom, and this was the root disease. His reign lasted 12 years, from the 172nd year after Aegon's conquest to the 184th, and in those 12 years he demonstrated with something approaching thoroughness what a kingdom looks like when its highest seat is occupied by a man who has confused consumption with authority. If you would rather follow this history with your eyes already closed, you can find us on Spotify. The link is in the description below. He was not without intelligence. This is the detail that the simplest tellings omit because stupidity would be easier to understand and easier to dismiss. What Aegon the Unworthy possessed instead was a genuine cunning placed entirely in the service of his appetites, an understanding of people that ran to considerable depth, a charm that could be activated or withdrawn with the precision that only experienced operators tend to manage. He was not merely a man who wanted things and took them crudely. He was a man who had learned how to make other men want to give him what he wanted, which is a more refined and in certain ways more dangerous capacity. His court was not simply a site of obvious excess. It was a political instrument, calibrated to make ambitious men comfortable enough to stop counting their exits. His queen was Nerys, his own sister, as Targaryen custom permitted, and the misfortune of her life was to be virtuous and gentle in a court that valued neither quality. She was small and frequently unwell, devoted to the Seven with a sincerity that might have found great contentment in a scepter's cell, and instead found itself beside a man whose feelings toward her ranged between indifference and a quiet, persistent contempt, not because she had done anything wrong, but perhaps because her consistent goodness was an ongoing, unspoken indictment of how he spent his days. She bore him one surviving son, and the birth came close to killing her. Her husband declined to offer her the consolation of a separate bedchamber in the long recovery that followed, a cruelty small enough to be deniable and specific enough to be felt every morning she woke in that room. The whispers about that son, Daeron, accumulated slowly and then all at once, as whispers always do when the soil is ready for them. The court understood. The court always understands in the sideways peripheral manner of institutions that know more than they choose to record, that Daenerys had been closer to her brother Aemon, who treated her with genuine kindness, than to the husband who did not. The tenderness between the queen and the prince was of the kind that invites speculation when it exists inside a marriage of obvious misery. The whispers never crystallized into formal accusation during Aegon's lifetime. After his death, they became a political tool. The suggestion that Daeron might not truly be Aegon's son, and therefore might not be the rightful heir to anything, and like all effective political weapons, their value lay not in being true, but in resisting disproof. The great bastards were, in the grim accounting of Aegon's reign, its one enduring output of genuine quality, produced not through intention, but through sheer appetite applied across sufficient time. He had sired bastards for decades, on women of every station, and the ones who grew to adulthood and received his formal acknowledgement formed a remarkable company. Daemon, the eldest and most beloved, silver-haired and violet-eyed, born of the princess Daena the Defiant, which meant he carried the Targaryen blood doubled, more concentrated than in almost anyone else living. Aegor Rivers, called Bittersteel, built for war and driven by something iron-hard beneath his considerable exterior. Brynden Rivers, called Bloodraven, pale as chalk with red eyes and a birthmark the shape of a raven spreading across half his face. A man whose intelligence made even his allies uneasy in proportion to how well they understood it. And Shiera Seastar, last and most beautiful, whose existence seemed to demonstrate that beauty could function as a form of power more durable and more precise than armies. Daemon was born of the Princess Daena, who had been imprisoned in what was known as the Maiden Vault by the previous king, a comfortable confinement for Targaryen women whose existence posed dynastic complications. The exact circumstances of his conception were not discussed openly, but the general understanding was clear, and Aegon's acknowledgement was immediate and unambiguous. Daemon grew up in the Red Keep as a royal bastard, trained alongside princes, educated by masters, and observed from very early to be something that did not fit comfortably into any existing category. His martial gifts appeared before he was old enough to carry a proper blade. The knights assigned to train him found themselves watching him longer than the work required. By the time he was old enough to ride a destrier in full armor and enter the lists, the songs about him were already being written, and this is the detail worth sitting with, because in most stories the songs come after the victories, but in Daemon's story they came before, as if even the singers understood that the victories were inevitable. If this story is settling something quiet in you, you can find us on Spotify as well. The link waits in the description, and this history carries just as much weight in the dark. The sword Blackfyre must be understood properly if the rest of this telling is to carry its full meaning. Forged in old Valyria by methods that died with the doom, black-bladed and faintly responsive to light in the way of all Valyrian steel, it was the sword that Aegon the Conqueror had carried across the narrow sea when he claimed 6 kingdoms in the Dragon's Shadow. Subsequent Targaryen kings had inherited it as the most legible symbol of dynastic continuity, more intimate than a crown, more ancient than the Iron Throne itself, more viscerally present than any decree living only on parchment. A king who gave Blackfyre to his heir confirmed the succession in the most visible possible terms. A king who gave it to someone other than his heir was doing something with no precedent and no innocent interpretation. Aegon the Unworthy gave the sword to Daemon. He gave the sword that meant kingship to a bastard. The meaning was not ambiguous, it was not accidental, and every lord who heard of it understood exactly what it said. It is worth sitting with that gesture rather than hurrying past it. The giving of Blackfyre was not a private exchange between a father and a favourite son. It happened in the presence of the court, with witnesses, in the idiom of public ritual that the dynasty had used for generations to communicate what mattered most. The lords present understood immediately what they had seen. Those who subsequently claimed not to remember it were making a deliberate choice to forget, which is its own kind of memory. Whatever Aegon intended, and his intentions are not recoverable from the record, the effect of his choice was to draw a line across the centre of the succession, to place the symbol of legitimate power on the bastard side of that line, and to leave the legitimate heir holding a claim that had just been publicly complicated by the very man whose authority gave that claim its substance. Here was the fracture at the centre of the realm. On one side, Daeron, the legitimate heir, thoughtful and measured, genuinely good in the ways that heirs can become when spared a father's worst attention. Slight in frame, large in mind, a scholar and a diplomat who would eventually prove to be among the better Targaryen kings, who built peace, honoured treaties, and administered without appetite. His most consequential achievement, the Dornish marriage alliance that ended a century of border conflict along the southern marches, was also the act that cost him the most loyalty among lords who had spent those same decades fighting Dornishmen, and could not understand why those Dornishmen should now be rewarded with a princess rather than a continued war. On the other side, Daemon, magnificent, carrying the sword, carrying twice the Targaryen blood, carrying the love of a court that had been taught to measure worth in martial terms, and then presented with this extraordinary specimen. The lords who preferred the story to the reality had somewhere to put their preference. We should probably sit with the particular cruelty of the position this created for both men rather than rushing past it toward the war. Daeron had done nothing wrong. He had been born into circumstances not of his choosing and responded to them with intelligence and decency. He could not retroactively change the fact that his father had given the ancestral sword to someone else, could not make himself appear more like the warrior king that the realm's romantic imagination demanded. Daemon had also done nothing wrong. He had been born with gifts he had not requested, accepted what his father placed in his hands, allowed the love of the court to gather around him without deliberately cultivating it. The catastrophe was built into the situation before either man made any consequential choice. Aegon the Unworthy had constructed the trap. It fell to his sons to discover they were already inside it. Among the other great bastards, the lines of loyalty were forming in ways that would define the following decades. Bittersteel's devotion to Daemon was total, the kind of absolute fidelity that certain driven people give to a person who seems to embody everything they cannot quite become themselves. Bittersteel was extraordinary, but Daemon was transcendent, and Bittersteel was self-aware enough to understand the difference and loyal enough to offer what he had anyway. Bloodraven's relationship with Daemon was more complex, colder, more oriented toward the institutional interests of the Targaryen crown than toward any particular person who sat upon it. And both of them moved in the particular gravity of Shiera Seastar, drawn to her, neither possessing her, neither entirely able to step away from the wanting of her, and this unresolvable tension between them coloured everything that followed, making each less able to read the other with anything resembling charity. Aegon's death, when it finally came, was not the death of a man who had treated his body as something worth preserving. The masters had attended him for the better part of a year before the end, managing with their arts what decades of excess had accumulated, and finding their arts insufficient to the task. The chamber where he spent his last weeks was close and warm, the smell of medicaments mingling with the low reek of tallow candles and the particular heaviness of rooms that have held a dying person through too many weeks. It was in this setting, the specific dimness of it, the weight of the air, the sound of the city continuing its business on the other side of the walls, that he called his witnesses and made his declaration and died, and left behind a kingdom that had spent 12 years enduring his presence and now discovered that his absence would cost even more. What the decree meant in the most immediate legal sense was the introduction of a rival claim into a world that already had a sitting king. The lords who wished to support Daemon now had a legal framework to hang their preferences on. The lords who supported Daeron now had to manage a complication introduced by the very man whose authority gave Daeron's claim its foundation. The dead do not answer questions. They leave their decisions behind them, insulated by death from all accountability, and the living negotiate with the consequences. The realm was not simply confused by what had happened. It was divided along the lines of pre-existing preference and grievance and self-interest, and the division, once visible, began to harden in the way that divisions do when they are given a clear shape to take. Daeron II took the Iron Throne and proved, over the years that followed, to be a genuinely good king, patient, just, capable of the kind of long-term thinking that benefits kingdoms enormously while bringing those who practice it very little short-term reward. He completed the Dornish peace and held it against sustained resentment. He governed without his father's appetites. He was decent in a role that does not always reward decency, and the decency was real. But patient kings carry a particular vulnerability. They govern for everyone, which means they fully satisfy no one, which means the faction of the perpetually dissatisfied always has somewhere to direct its energy. And in the 184th year after Aegon's conquest, the dissatisfied had Daemon Blackfyre, silver-haired, carrying the conqueror's sword, looking like everything the songs said a Targaryen ruler was supposed to look like, looking like a story is, in politics, as in nearly everything else, very often enough. The shadow of all this reaches forward through centuries, and arrives eventually in the age we know from the great stories. Jon Snow, in a different crisis and a different winter, stood at a structurally comparable position, raised to believe himself a bastard, carrying in his blood a royal claim he was never told he had, surrounded by forces that wanted different things from him for reasons he could not fully see. The difference was that Jon's legitimacy was real, a secret marriage, a genuine succession, a biological fact waiting to be uncovered. Daemon's was manufactured, a dying king's decree, legally questionable, morally dubious, and politically catastrophic. And yet in both cases the underlying question was identical: what makes a king? Whether blood alone is sufficient, or whether blood requires acknowledgement and witness and record before it can mean anything at all. Aegon the Unworthy opened that question on the night of his death. It has not been fully closed since. There is nothing you need to carry forward from this moment. The chamber where Aegon died has been cold for 800 years. The witnesses to his final command are returned to the earth, and the earth has had time enough to forget them entirely. What remains is the story, and stories do not require your effort to persist. They will wait for you, as all old things wait, with the patience of things that have already outlasted the attention they were given and the neglect that followed. Let your body settle into whatever is beneath you. Let your breathing find its own slower rhythm. The 184th year after Aegon's conquest ended in a death and a decree and a question with no clean answer. We will follow that question wherever it leads. But the following can be gentle. There is nowhere it needs to go faster than it goes. In the halls of the Red Keep, a young man with silver hair and a black Valyrian blade was standing in the space between what the law said he was and what a sword implied he might become. He had not yet decided. The decision was forming around him the way weather forms, out of conditions already present, already in motion, already building toward the only resolution they were capable of producing. His name was Daemon, and the realm was beginning, in its quiet and collective way, to hold its breath. Daemon Blackfyre was, by near universal account among the maesters and lords of his age, the finest warrior in the Seven Kingdoms, and this was not the kind of claim that lords made casually, because lords who praised the prowess of other men were implicitly measuring themselves against it, and the measure was always unflattering. He had unhorsed knights twice his age before he was old enough to shave. He had ended jousts in a single pass when the custom was 3. He had walked out of melee tournaments that began with 30 participants and ended with him standing at the center, unhurt, in the particular way of people who are not simply skilled, but operating at a register so far beyond the difficulty of the task that the task is essentially not a contest at all. He carried, always, the black Valyrian sword his father had given him instead of the legitimate heir. And in the symbolism of that blade, held in those hands, worn at that particular man's hip, everything that would eventually set the realm on fire was already present. Let your thoughts settle now. The great questions of legitimacy and inheritance and war are important. They are the very bones of the story we are following. But they are also 8 centuries old, and oldness has a calming quality if you allow it. You are not a participant in any of this. You are a witness in the quiet dark, resting, listening, following a thread whose end is already recorded in books that have been written for centuries and will persist for centuries more. Nothing about what we will follow is unresolved. The uncertainty is only in what it means, and meaning is exactly what the darkness and the silence are for. Let your body be heavy. Let the room hold you. The story will carry you where it goes. If you would prefer to follow this with your eyes already closed, we are on Spotify. The link is in the description, and the history sounds no less true in the dark. Daemon was born of the Princess Daena the Defiant in circumstances the court chose not to examine too precisely. His mother had been confined for years to a set of comfortable apartments known as the Maiden Vault, imprisoned by dynastic logic in the way that inconvenient women often were, and she emerged from that confinement with a child whose father was never formally named by anyone with authority to name him. The general understanding was that Aegon IV was responsible. The physical evidence of silver hair and violet eyes in their most concentrated form was persuasive, and Aegon's acknowledgement was immediate and unambiguous, and over time escalating into something that the court recognized as a kind of love. The acknowledgement was the first gift, the sword was the second. Between the two of them, Aegon the Unworthy gave his bastard son everything except the throne, and in doing so made the throne the one thing that could not be refused without the rest of the gifts becoming meaningless. He grew up in the Red Keep, in the complicated position of the beloved royal bastard, acknowledged, educated, given everything that preparation requires, and then placed beside the legitimate prince whose inheritance all of that preparation was not supposed to threaten. The maesters who taught him and the knights who trained him were consistent in their assessments. There was a quality to Daemon that did not appear in the other young men around him, something that training was building on rather than creating, some foundational gift that would have expressed itself regardless of what was placed above it. He was not simply talented. He was organized differently from most people, in a way that showed in everything from the way he sat a horse to the way he navigated the social architecture of the court, with an ease that was not performance, that was not the effort to appear at ease, but the real thing. By the time he was in his middle teens, the lords who visited King's Landing on matters of court business had begun to arrange their schedules around the possibility of watching him compete. This is recorded in accounts that are not trying to be flattering, matter-of-fact notes in the diaries of various lords and their stewards, mentioning that the journey to the capital was timed to coincide with a tournament because Daemon Blackfyre was expected to enter. Lords who had ridden hard for 3 days to argue about grain levies stayed an extra week because they had heard he would be in the lists, and they did not want to have missed it. He had, before he had fought a single battle of consequence, the particular quality of someone who makes people want to witness him. This quality is rare enough that when it appears, the people around it tend to project meaning onto it, to decide without quite deciding that such a person must be destined for something commensurate with the impression they make. The songs that were written about him are worth noting because of when they were written. Before the rebellion, before any battle had occurred that could have provided their subject matter. Singers composed verses about his tourney victories, yes, but also about something less tangible, about the quality of his presence, the way he stood, the way he carried the sword, the way he looked when he was thinking about nothing in particular. Songs are a form of public emotion, a collective expression of what a community feels strongly enough to put into repeatable form, and the communities that were writing songs about Daemon Blackfyre before his legend was properly earned were expressing something that had very little to do with his tournament results, and everything to do with what he represented. They were singing about the idea of him. They were singing about what they needed him to be. Bittersteel was always present in this story, occupying the position that certain people occupy when they find someone they are willing to subordinate themselves to completely. Not out of weakness, but out of a kind of love that fierce people feel when they encounter something they recognize as greater than themselves. Bittersteel was not a small person. He was an exceptional warrior and a capable commander in his own right, a man who would have dominated almost any context he entered. And yet in Daemon's presence, he was always the second figure, the loyal one, the one who stood behind and to the right. He did not seem to resent this. He seemed, if anything, to find in it a kind of satisfaction, as if the quality he could recognize in Daemon was exactly the quality that his own furious and devoted nature had been looking for all along, a thing finally worthy of the loyalty he had always been capable of offering. Bloodraven occupied a different position entirely. He and Daemon were half-brothers, and they were, in the way of certain siblings, genuinely fond of each other in the early years. The pale, one-eyed spy master and the silver-haired warrior, a pairing that the court found interesting and slightly unsettling. But Bloodraven's loyalty was always to the crown and to the legitimacy of the succession, and as Daemon's position became increasingly complicated, as the question of what his existence implied became increasingly impossible to ignore, Bloodraven's fondness for his brother developed a colder layer beneath it. He cared for Daemon in the way a man might care for a fire that is burning too close to something important, with genuine warmth and with the absolute understanding that if it came to a choice between the warmth and the thing it threatened, the thing would have to be preserved. The tension between Bittersteel and Bloodraven ran through Shiera Seastar like a fault line through stone. Both of them wanted her. Neither of them possessed her in any complete sense. Bittersteel wanted her the way he wanted most things, with urgency and fervour and without much patience for the complications she represented. Bloodraven kept her close with a kind of proprietary attention that Bittersteel found intolerable, partly because it was effective and partly because the thing that made it intolerable was that it seemed to be what Shiera wanted, or at least what she accepted, which in a person of her capabilities might have amounted to the same thing. Their hatred of each other was real and long-standing and personal, and it meant that the political disagreement between them, between the man who would give everything to Daemon and the man who would give everything to the crown, was reinforced by a personal animosity that made compromise essentially impossible. When they were eventually on opposite sides of a war, neither of them made any effort to limit the scope of their opposition. The lords who came to Daemon with suggestions were not, most of them, villains in the simple sense. Some were opportunists, some were men with specific grievances against Daeron's administration. But many were people who had looked at the situation created by Aegon the Unworthy and concluded, not unreasonably, that the question of rightful succession was genuinely unresolved, that a dying king's legitimization decree had created a legal ambiguity that the realm had a legitimate interest in resolving. They told Daemon what they saw, that he was loved, that he was capable, that half the lords of the kingdom would follow a black banner if he raised one, that the Dornish marriage had cost Daron a loyalty he could not easily recover, that the sword in Daemon's hand was the most eloquent possible argument for his claim. They were not wrong about any of these individual facts. They were profoundly wrong about the arithmetic they added them up to. The Dornish marriage was the wound that would not close. Daeron had purchased peace along the southern marches through an alliance sealed with royal marriages, a genuine diplomatic achievement, an end to 100 years of conflict that had swallowed enormous numbers of lives on both sides and settled nothing permanent. But the lords who had spent those same years fighting along those same marches did not experience the peace as an achievement. They experienced it as an erasure. It suggested that all the years and all the dead had been in service of an outcome that could have been reached any time, that the Dornishmen were to be welcomed at court and given seats at the table and married into the family. The resentment was real, and it was not stupid, even if where it eventually led was catastrophic. Those lords had given their sons, and the sons were not coming back, and the peace felt less like a triumph than like a receipt for a debt that had never been fully explained to the men who were being made to pay it. We should probably sit with the weight of that resentment for a moment before we move forward. History tends to be unkind to the losing side of wars, and the men who followed Daemon Blackfyre are usually presented in the simple terms of ambition and disloyalty, which erases the degree to which many of them were acting on something they experienced as a genuine grievance. They felt their sacrifices had been dismissed. They felt the kingdom they had fought to defend had been handed to the people they had been fighting. They felt that the legitimate heir in making the Dornish peace had revealed something about his priorities that they could not accept. And into all of that feeling, Daemon Blackfyre arrived like a specific kind of answer. Not the wisest answer, not the safest answer, but the answer that felt right to people who were tired of being told that wisdom required them to feel nothing. The question of whether Daemon himself wanted to be king is one the records do not definitively resolve. He had not engineered the legitimization decree. He had not asked for the sword. He had not gone from castle to castle recruiting supporters for a claim. What he had done was exist, with visibility and magnetism and the particular gravity that certain people carry without effort, and allow the world to project its desires onto that existence. The rebellion that eventually formed around him was not simply his idea. It was something that assembled itself in the spaces around him, the way certain kinds of weather assemble themselves around points of existing pressure. He may have accepted it more than he chose it. He may have understood, at some point in the years before the banner went up, that the choice had already been made by the conditions he was living in, and that refusing it would require a kind of active effort that he was either unwilling or unable to apply. He raised the banner eventually. The precise circumstances are debated in the records. Exactly which lord's encouragement was the last. Exactly which slight from the Daron court was the final provocation. exactly what moment it was when Daemon moved from accepting the possibility of rebellion to accepting the actuality of it. What is recorded is the banner itself, black, where Targaryen red would have been, the dragon rendered in reversed colours, a deliberate and visible inversion of the dynasty's symbol, a black dragon on red instead of a red dragon on black. It was not a rejection of the Targaryen lineage. It was a rival reading of it, a claim not to be something different from the dynasty but to be its truer expression, the line that the inheritance should have followed if the unworthy had not complicated the succession, and if the law had corresponded more closely to what the sword in his hand already said. It is worth sitting with the significance of that inversion, the choice of black rather than an entirely new device, because it tells us something about what the first Blackfyre Rebellion was and was not. It was not a revolution. It was not a claim that the Targaryen dynasty was wrong or should be replaced with something different. It was a claim about which Targaryen should sit the throne. The men who followed Daemon did not consider themselves traitors to the dynasty. They considered themselves the dynasty's truer servants, correcting a wrong that the unworthy king had created and that the current king's existence perpetuated. This is what made the rebellion genuinely dangerous in a way that simple opportunism would not have been. Nearly half the lords of the Seven Kingdoms believed the question was unresolved, and believing that, they chose an answer. Breathe. There is no urgency here. The armies are not yet assembled. The banners are raised, but the battles are still forming, still choosing their shapes. You are here in the quiet between decision and consequence, in the particular stillness that great events always carry within them, just before they become the things history records them as. Nothing is yet determined. Everything is in motion. And somewhere across the continent, a pale half-brother with red eyes and a raven's mark on his face is already beginning to move his pieces into position, because Bloodraven's gift was always to be 3 moves ahead of the present in a game that most people were only just beginning to understand they were playing. The thread that connects Daemon Blackfyre's raised banner to the wars of the modern age, to the conflicts we know from the Songs of Winter, is a thread that never fully breaks. Every time a great house raised a banner against the Iron Throne, every time a man with a claim and a name and a following decided the existing power was insufficient, the shape of that decision was first sketched here in the 196th year after Aegon's conquest, when Daemon Blackfyre asked the question in Steel and Fire, does the law make the king, or does the king make the law? Robert Baratheon would ask it. Renly would ask it. Stannis would insist on a particular answer to it that cost him everything. The question never finds a resting place. It simply moves from one age to the next, wearing a different face. There is nothing you need to hold in this darkness. The banner has been raised. The question has been asked. The consequences are already moving through the world at their own pace. The pace of armies and ravens and loyalties shifting in great houses across the length of the continent. All of it is in motion. None of it requires your attention to continue. Let your breathing slow to something natural. Let the heaviness of rest come into your body. The first Blackfyre Rebellion has begun, and the story will be here for you, patient and unchanged, whenever you choose to follow it further. Daemon Blackfyre had made his choice. Half the lords of the Seven Kingdoms had made theirs. And in the Red Keep, a pale man with one eye and a raven's mark across his face, a man who had loved his half-brother and had calculated with cold precision what that love was going to cost him, was preparing to answer the question in the only language that the sword eventually understands. The first Blackfyre Rebellion had begun, and the Redgrass Field was waiting. When the ravens carrying news of Daemon Blackfyre's raised banner reached King's Landing in the 196th year after Aegon's conquest, they found a court that was not, in its honest moments, entirely surprised. The signs had been accumulating for years, the whispered conversations in the corridors of great castles, the loyalty oaths that had been given with a particular kind of careful phrasing that left room for reinterpretation, the lords who had attended royal tournaments primarily to watch Daemon compete and had returned to their seats with expressions that their stewards had learned not to ask about. The realm had been dividing along a line that everyone could see, and no one had been willing to name. Now the line had a name, and nearly half the lords of the Seven Kingdoms found themselves standing on the far side of it, looking across at their king, and having to decide whether they believed what they had told themselves they believed. Let yourself rest into this moment. You are deep in a very old story now, in the part where the consequences of a dying king's last decision have finally become visible, where the abstract question of succession has taken on the specific weight of armies and castle gates and ravens flying fast across grey skies. Breathe slowly. The battles ahead of us are decided. Every lord who chose a side in the 196th year after Aegon's conquest has already chosen it, has already lived with that choice for as long as they lived, has already passed into the great silence of the dead, where all choices eventually arrive. You are only a listener in the dark. The history holds you. There is nowhere you need to go. The political geography of the rebellion, in its first weeks, was a map of grievance and calculation and genuine conviction drawn across the landscape of the Seven Kingdoms. The Reach provided many of Daemon's strongest supporters, lords who had fought Dornishmen for generations and could not forgive Daeron his peace, who had watched the Dornish princess arrive at court and had found the sight of her there more than they were prepared to tolerate. The Stormlands contributed their share, men who valued martial excellence above the Scholar King's measured governance and who had decided, sometimes genuinely and sometimes because the decision suited their interests, that Daemon's claim was the more rightful one. The Crown lands were divided as close to evenly as any region, with houses that had long-standing personal loyalties to the Red Keep arrayed against houses that had long-standing personal connections to the Blackfyre name. The Lannisters, who governed the wealthiest region in the realm from their seat at Casterly Rock, presented Daeron II with one of the rebellion's more anxious uncertainties in its early stages. Their lord at the time was cautious in the manner of powerful men who understand that the value of their position is precisely what makes it a target, and caution in the case of the Lannister lord meant a period of watchful assessment that neither side could fully read. Ultimately, the Westerlands stayed largely loyal to the Iron Throne, the gold of Casterly Rock lending its enormous weight to the royalist cause, but the time it took for that loyalty to declare itself was time that Daemon's supporters used to build momentum, to send more ravens, to persuade more houses that the tide was running in a particular direction. Daeron II's response to the rebellion was calibrated and, in retrospect, strategically intelligent, though it would not be remembered as such because the manner of the eventual victory obscured the careful work that made it possible. He did not panic. He did not strip the northern and eastern borders of their defences to mass troops in the south. He sent for the Dornish. This was, to the lords who had opposed the Dornish marriage alliance from the beginning, precisely the wrong response. The proof, if proof were needed, that Daeron's first loyalty was to his southern in-laws rather than to the ancient traditions of the realm. To the lords who had supported the alliance, and to the coldly strategic Bloodraven who was managing the royalist military intelligence from behind the scenes, it was the obvious move. The Dornish had signed a treaty, and the treaty now meant something very specific, and Daeron was right to call in what he had paid for. Bloodraven's role in the royalist cause in these early months was not primarily martial, though he was capable of fighting when the situation required it. His role was informational, the management of a network of agents and informants that reached into demons' councils and into the camps of uncertain lords and into the household staffs of castles that had not yet declared their allegiances. He is said to have known, before the battle lines were fully drawn, which lords would cross to Daemon's side and which were too frightened of the consequences to follow through on their apparent sympathies. He used this knowledge to move royalist forces into positions that cut off certain lords from each other, to intercept certain correspondences, and to ensure that what appeared to be a spontaneous rebellion was in fact being guided without its commander's knowledge toward a battlefield that Daeron's forces had chosen for reasons that Daemon's advisors never fully understood. It is worth pausing on that thought. The way in which intelligence advantages shape wars in ways that the histories of battles tend not to capture, because intelligence does its best work before anyone draws a sword, in the quiet spaces where plans are being made by men who don't know their plans are already known. Bloodraven's 1,000 Eyes and One, the name that was already circulating as a description of his spy network, were not a supernatural gift. They were the accumulated result of years of deliberate cultivation, of making people into agents through a mixture of incentive and pressure that Bloodraven managed with the patience of a man who thought in decades rather than seasons. He had built this network in the years before the rebellion. He spent it freely when the rebellion came. The figure of Sir Quentin Ball, called Fireball, belongs to this period of the rebellion as one of its most vivid and tragic elements. He was among the finest knights of his generation, swift, powerful, technically accomplished in ways that the tournaments of his era had made him famous for, and he was absolutely loyal to Daemon Blackfyre with the particular quality of loyalty that great knights give to lords they have decided deserve them. He rode at the head of Blackfyre columns in the early engagements of the campaign, and his presence there was itself a kind of argument for Daemon's cause. When the best knight in the kingdom has chosen a side, lesser knights find themselves reconsidering which side they had been intending to choose. His death, before the armies reached the field that would decide everything, was a blow to the Blackfyre cause that no individual replacement could entirely compensate for. The loss not just of a knight, but of a symbol, a proof that the rebellion was not invincible, that even its greatest champions could be reached. The march toward what would become the Redgrass Field took weeks. The armies were large, and the kingdom's roads were not built for the rapid movement of tens of thousands of men, and so the approach to the decisive engagement was a slow affair, measured in hours of dust and the weight of armor and the particular exhaustion of men who are marching towards something they understand might kill them. The royalist forces moved from the east, augmented by the Dornish contingent that had answered Daeron's call. The Blackfyre forces moved to meet them from the west and south, their column carrying the particular quality of armies that believe they are fighting on the right side of history. Confident, purposeful, energized by the conviction that the cause they are marching for is worth the march. We should probably sit with the experience of those weeks for a moment before we arrive at the field itself, not the generals and their strategies, but the men who walked. The knights who slept in their armor because the ground was cold and removing it would cost too much time in the morning. The common soldiers who had been levied from their villages and who understood the broad strokes of what they were marching toward without understanding the specific reasons well enough to argue for them. The Dornish spearmen in Daeron's column, riding through a kingdom that had spent a century regarding their people as enemies, past villages whose inhabitants watched them with expressions that contained histories of conflict too long and too specific to be resolved by a marriage alliance that was only a decade old. All of these people were part of the history that moved toward the Redgrass Field. Most of them are not remembered individually, but they were there. In Daemon's column, the atmosphere seems to have been something between a crusade and a tournament procession in its early stages. The energy of men who believe they are correcting a wrong, the presence of their extraordinary commander giving the whole enterprise the quality of a story that is happening rather than a story that is being made. Daemon rode at the front. The sword Blackfyre was visible at his hip, the black blade catching the autumn light in the way of Valyrian steel, which always seems to carry more light than it has any reason to. The lords around him recorded later that he had the quality, in those weeks of the march, of a man who has made a decision and arrived at a kind of peace on the far side of it, not serene, not happy in any simple sense, but settled, as if the uncertainty that had occupied the years before the banner was raised had resolved itself into something he could live with. Bloodraven was watching all of this through his network of eyes, and his assessments were communicated to Daeron's command in the form of intelligence that the royalist generals could use without necessarily understanding how it had been obtained. He knew where Daemon's forces were. He knew roughly how many men they had. He knew which lords in Daemon's column were genuinely committed to the cause and which were following out of momentum or obligation and might break if the right pressure were applied at the right moment. He had been choosing the ground for the decisive battle for weeks before the armies began to converge on it, a field in the heart of the realm where certain geographical features gave the royalist forces advantages that were not obvious to an army approaching from the west. There is a kind of grief that belongs to the period just before a great battle, and the histories tend not to dwell in it because the battle and its results are what fill the page. But the night before a decisive engagement is its own specific experience, very different from the battles themselves, quieter, heavier, the air in the camps carrying the particular weight of knowledge that cannot be acted on yet. Men who would be dead by the following evening sat with their companions and their fires and their thoughts. The common soldiers talked about food and home and the things that common soldiers always talk about when they have run out of other topics. The lords and knights checked their armor and their weapons and thought about the morning in the way of men who have fought before and know what morning brings. Daemon spent that night, the last night before the Redgrass Field, among his sons. This is recorded in more than one account, the specific detail of it preserved because people who remembered him afterward wanted to preserve it, the image of the great warrior among the people who were closest to him in the hours before everything changed. His twin sons, Aegon and Aemon, were young men by this time, old enough to fight, bearing their father's colouring and something of his quality. They would be in the battle the following day. He knew this. They knew this. What was said between them in those hours is not recorded anywhere in the Citadel's accounts. What is recorded is that they were together, and that when morning came, they rode out together, and that this was the last night they would ever have. You do not need to carry the weight of what is coming. The Redgrass Field has been in the past for 800 years, and what happened there is fixed in the record, unchangeable, already resolved in the only way it was ever going to be resolved. You are here, in the dark, following the story from a safe and enormous distance. Let that distance hold you. Let the room around you have its temperature, its quiet, its particular quality of stillness. The armies are assembled on opposite sides of the field. The morning light is cold and flat. The birds that do not know anything about wars or kings are beginning, as birds do, to sound the start of the day. And somewhere in the Blackfyre column, a young man with silver hair is putting on his armor and picking up the black sword and preparing to do what he has always done in contests, to be extraordinary, to make it look effortless, to be exactly what the stories needed him to be. The parallel that runs from the Redgrass Field forward to the age we know from the great songs is not difficult to trace. The War of the Five Kings, which tore the Seven Kingdoms apart in the years of winter, was built on the same foundations, on questions of legitimate succession, on lords who believed the wrong person sat the throne, on armies marching toward each other with the specific conviction that they were right and the other side was the obstacle to rightness. Robb Stark, who raised his own banner in the north and was called king by men who believed he deserved it, was not a Blackfyre, but he was repeating a structural argument that Daemon Blackfyre had first made, that the claim in the hall was not the only claim available, and that strength and love and the willingness of men to follow could constitute a kind of legitimacy even when the formal genealogical record pointed somewhere else. The argument ended the same way both times. It tends to. There is nothing more you need to be alert for tonight. The story has brought you here, to the eve of the battle, and this is a good place to rest for a moment in the telling. The armies are present, the banners are planted, the decisions that brought everyone to this field have all been made. What remains is the mourning. And the morning can wait, as mornings always can, until the listener is ready. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Let the stillness of the room be the stillness of that field before the day began, the particular quiet of a large space in which many people are pretending to sleep or trying to sleep, or lying awake with thoughts they cannot put down. The lords who hesitated longest before declaring their allegiances were, in certain ways, the most interesting figures in the rebellion's political landscape. Not the committed Blackfyre supporters, who had made their choice years before Daemon raised his banner and were simply waiting for the moment to declare it openly. Not the committed royalists, whose loyalty to the Iron Throne was structural rather than emotional, and who had no real option that did not involve considerable risk. The hesitators were the men who had genuine reasons on both sides, lords who had personal affection for Daemon but institutional loyalty to the crown, lords who resented the Dornish marriage but feared what a Blackfyre victory would mean for their specific position in the hierarchy that followed. Their eventual choices, made under the pressure of moving events, were often the choices that determined which direction a region as a whole inclined, because lords watched each other as carefully as they watched the armies, and a powerful lord's declaration changed the calculus for everyone in his orbit. The realm's ordinary people, the small folk, the craftsmen, the farmers who worked the fields that armies would eventually march across, are the absent presence in all of this, as they are the absent presence in all stories of dynastic politics. They did not choose a side in the way that lords chose sides. Their allegiance was largely determined by whoever controlled the land they lived on, and their experience of the rebellion was largely determined by the specific path of the armies rather than any political conviction about the legitimacy question. What the accounts of the rebellion's countryside passage suggest, reading between the lines of records written by people who did not think the small folk's perspective was worth preserving in its own right, is that the rebellion was experienced by most people not as a political event but as a disruption, an interruption of the ordinary rhythms of work and season that left behind, in some cases, the specific and lingering damage of armies that need to eat and have no particular reason to ask permission. The sun rose over the Redgrass Field on a morning in the 196th year after Aegon's conquest. The armies were arrayed. The banners moved in a light wind that would not be strong enough to affect the flight of arrows. And somewhere on the hill of Weeping Wood, a pale man with red eyes and a raven's mark across his face was positioning his archers in the darkness before dawn, because Bloodraven's gift was to see what the battle would require before the battle had begun, and he had already decided how it would end. At the Battle of the Redgrass Field, in the 196th year after Aegon's conquest, Daemon Blackfyre fought with the sword Blackfyre in his right hand and cut through the royalist lines the way weather moves through an open landscape, not resisted so much as endured, not stopped so much as outlasted, and the knights and soldiers who encountered him on that field described it afterward in the helpless language of people who had witnessed something beyond the ordinary scale of human capacity. He unhorsed lords. He broke cavalry charges that should not have been breakable. He fought for hours without the performance degrading, without the edge of him dulling, without any of the qualities that made him what he was showing the first signs of being exhausted by the scale of what they were being asked to do. And then a single arrow, loosed from the hill of weeping wood by archers positioned in the pre-dawn dark, struck him, and everything stopped. Let your breath slow. What we are approaching in this part of the telling is the weight of a single day, a day that lasted perhaps 10 hours from the first clash of arms to the last echo of retreating hooves that cost the Seven Kingdoms more than any individual battle of that century, and that determined, in one sequence of events on one autumn afternoon, the shape of the following 100 years. It is a heavy thing to approach in the dark, in the quiet, but heaviness does not require your effort. You only need to follow where the story goes. Let it carry you. The field is already decided. The outcome is already in the record. You are simply here as a witness to something that happened 8 centuries ago and still, in its quiet way, echoes. The armies came together in the morning, in the cold, flat light that early autumn produces in the middle of the realm, the quality of light that makes distances seem shorter than they are and makes everything look slightly older than it is. The royalist forces had the advantage of the ground. They had arrived first and had time to choose their positions, and Bloodraven had ensured that the positions they chose presented specific difficulties to the Blackfyre formations. The Blackfyre forces were not significantly outnumbered. The accounts vary, but the armies were close in size, which means the battle turned not on numbers but on the specific events of the day, on particular decisions made and not made, on the luck that is present in every battle and that the best commanders understand they cannot eliminate but can arrange to fall in their favor more often than not. Daemon's personal conduct in the early phases of the battle was everything that the songs had promised it would be. And that is a rare enough thing to be worth noting, because songs have a tendency to outpace reality in the upward direction. He rode into the royalist lines and made the kind of impression that cavalry charges make when the person leading them is operating at a level the defenders cannot match or predict. The black sword moved in ways that contemporaries struggled to describe adequately, the Valyrian steel seeming to carry its own momentum independent of the arm wielding it, though of course that was the arm and the gift behind the arm and not anything supernatural about the blade itself. He cut through positions that the royalist generals had expected to hold. He created openings that his supporting cavalry could exploit. He fought in a way that was recognizably the same thing his entire army had been marching toward for weeks, the proof that the cause deserved its champion. His twin sons rode with him, Aegon and Daemon Blackfyre, young men who had grown up in their father's shadow and had developed in that shadow the particular qualities that people develop when they are trying to be worthy of an extraordinary parent. Qualities of effort and discipline and a certain fierceness that was partly their own and partly borrowed from proximity to someone whose ferocity was simply innate. They fought near Daemon throughout the day, which was something between a personal choice and a tactical arrangement, because his command position was also the most dangerous position on the field, and remaining near him was a way of choosing the thing that mattered most and accepting the risks that came with the choice. They were very close to him when the arrows came. The Raven's Teeth were Bloodraven's creation, a unit of archers selected for their accuracy and their willingness to operate in conditions that other archers would have refused, positioned before dawn in the pre-battle dark on the Hill of Weeping Wood, where their angle of fire gave them specific advantages that Bloodraven had calculated in advance. They had been told what to wait for. They had been told which part of the field to watch. And they had the patience that Bloodraven's training instilled, which was the patience of people who understand that the right shot, taken at the right moment, is worth more than 10 shots taken too early. They watched the battle from their darkened hill. They waited for the configuration that Bloodraven had described, and when it arrived, they loosed. The arrow that struck Daemon Blackfyre has been attributed to Bloodraven himself in most of the accounts that survive, though the distance from the Weeping Wood to the position where Daemon fell is such that the shot, if accurate, would have required conditions of stillness and precision that are difficult to sustain in the middle of a large battle. Whether it was Bloodraven's own shaft or one of his raven's teeth who loosed it, the effect was the same. Daemon fell. The black sword was still in his hand when he hit the ground. And around the place where he fell, the battle did not immediately stop. Battles are not elegant in that way. Do not pause for the significance of individual deaths, even when those deaths are historically enormous. But something happened to the quality of the fighting. Something left the Blackfyre formations in the moment their commander went down that did not return. Aegon and Aemon died in the same arrow storm that killed their father. The accounts are specific about this. The three of them fell in very close succession. The twins struck by shafts that may have been intended for them specifically or may have been part of the general volley that the Raven's Teeth loosed when they were given the signal. The detail that the histories have preserved, and preserved with the kind of care that suggests the people who recorded it understood its significance, is that the twins died trying to reach their father after he was struck. That they were moving toward him when the arrows found them. That the last action of their lives was an attempt to do something for a man who was already past being helped by anything their lives could offer. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment, not to dwell in the grief of it, but to understand what the Battle of the Redgrass Field actually cost on that single day. 3 people of extraordinary promise, all of them, the father and the twin sons who were his most visible continuation into the future. The Blackfyre line did not end at the Redgrass Field. There were other sons, younger, who had not fought that day and who went into exile with Bittersteel. But the best of it, the concentrated essence of what the Blackfyre cause had been asking the realm to choose, was extinguished in the space of a few minutes on a field in the middle of the 7 kingdoms by archers on a hill in the dark. Bittersteel reached Daemon after it was over, or as close to over as it was ever going to be. There are accounts of what he saw when he arrived at the place where Daemon and his sons had fallen, and the accounts agree that what they saw in Bittersteel in that moment was not something that a person could put a familiar name to. Not simple grief, not rage in the ordinary sense, but something that combined all of the most extreme versions of both into a response that the men around him described with the careful language of people who had been frightened by what they were witnessing. He was deeply wounded in the fighting that surrounded this moment. Accounts vary on exactly how and by whose hand, and some of the men who were with him believed, looking at the wound, that he would not survive it. He survived it. He survived everything, ultimately, in the specific way of people for whom survival is itself a form of punishment. The royalist forces pressed their advantage in the hours after Daemon fell. The Blackfyre formations, without their commander, lost the coherence that Daemon's presence had been providing. Not because the other leaders were incompetent, but because coherence of that kind is not a property of organizations. It is a property of specific people, and when those people are removed, the coherence they were providing cannot simply be reassigned to someone else. The Blackfyre lines began to fold. Lords who had committed to the rebellion with reservations found those reservations becoming more available to them as the afternoon progressed. The retreat became a rout in certain sectors, not because the Blackfyre soldiers were cowards, but because the thing they had been fighting for had been removed from the field, and fighting for an idea in the abstract is considerably harder than fighting for a man you can see. The field afterward. This is what the histories always hurry past, because it is not dramatic in the way of battles and is very dramatic in the way of things that are difficult to look at directly. The Redgrass Field was red in a more literal sense by the time the sun touched the western horizon. The work of recovering the dead began before the fighting was fully over, the way it always does, the living moving among the still while the last sounds of conflict were still audible at the field's far edges. Daemon's body was recovered by royalist forces. The sword Blackfyre was recovered with it. What happened to the sword in the immediate aftermath? Whether it was placed back in the armory, whether Daeron looked at it, whether he thought of his half-brother when he held it, or whether he could not bear to hold it at all, is not recorded anywhere in the accounts that survive. We should probably sit with the aftermath rather than leaving it too quickly. Daeron II had won. He had preserved the succession. He had demonstrated, in the most final possible terms, that the question his father had opened with the legitimization decree could be answered by force when it could not be answered by law, and yet the victory did not feel, by the accounts of those who were present for its immediate aftermath, like the clean and unambiguous thing that victories are supposed to be. The men who had died on both sides had been subjects of the realm. Many of them had been loyal to different things with different reasoning, but loyal. The king who had won was a good king who had wanted, from the beginning, not to have to fight this war at all. The war had happened anyway, and the cost of it was visible, in a specific and unmovable way, on a field that would be called the Redgrass Field from that day forward. Bittersteel was carried from the field by the men who had been with him, in the state of a man who is simultaneously not dead and not fully alive in the way he had been before. His wound was severe. His grief was more severe. The men who attended him in the days that followed described him as quiet in a way that Bittersteel had never previously been quiet, a silence that was not calm, but the opposite of calm, the silence of an extremely violent emotion that has no outlet proportionate to its scale. He did not speak much about Daemon. He did not speak much about anything. He looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man who is in the process of converting grief into something harder and more durable, because grief in its raw form is unbearable, and the only way to carry it forward through a life is to change its texture into something that can be used. The connection that runs from the Redgrass Field to the losses we know from the age of the Great Wars is a thread of grief converted into purpose, the specific grief of people who have lost something irreplaceable and have decided that the only response available to them is to continue. Ned Stark, holding the sword of his dead brother in the Tower of Joy's aftermath, carrying a secret too heavy to share and a grief too specific to be expressed in ordinary terms, was doing something structurally similar to what Bittersteel did in the hours after the Redgrass Field, converting the unbearable into something he could carry. The weight is the same. The conversion is the same. Only the names and the specific circumstances differ. There is nothing you need to do with any of this. The Redgrass Field is finished. The dead have been where they are for 8 centuries. Bittersteel has already made his conversion and spent his grief as something harder in a life that continued for decades past this day. You are here in the dark, in the quiet, at an enormous and safe distance from all of it. Let the distance hold you. Let your body find the ease that comes when there is nothing left to manage. The first Blackfyre Rebellion ended on this field in the 196th year after Aegon's conquest, with a single arrow and 3 bodies in the grass and 1 man carried away still breathing, already beginning the process of turning what he felt into what the next generation would become. The Royalist command in the hours after Daemon fell faced a specific kind of problem that military victories sometimes produce: the need to manage a success that is larger and faster than expected. The Blackfyre formations collapsing did not mean that the individual Blackfyre soldiers simply stopped fighting. Some of them fought harder, the way cornered things fight, with the particular ferocity of people who have nothing left to manage their fear with except aggression. Capturing Lords of Consequence rather than simply killing them was a priority that the Royalist commanders had to maintain against the momentum of an afternoon's worth of killing, against soldiers who had spent hours being frightened and were now in the position where the fear could be expressed. How many of the Blackfyre dead needed to be dead in the precise way they ended up dead is a question the records do not engage with. It is the question that always hovers over the accounting of battles, unasked. The political work of the aftermath began before the bodies were cold. Daeron II was, by all accounts, not a man who found the work of aftermath pleasurable, which is one of the things that distinguished him from many of his predecessors and successors on the Iron Throne. He was required to determine which lords who had fought for Daemon could be forgiven, which could be forgiven at a cost, and which could not be forgiven at all, a calculation that had to be performed while also ensuring that the calculation was not so severe that it drove the surviving Blackfyre sympathizers into a posture of permanent irreconcilability. Mercy, in the political vocabulary of aftermath, was not simply kindness. It was a tool for closing a wound that might otherwise remain open long enough to fester. Daeron used it carefully, which is the most that can be said of anyone who has to use such a tool in such circumstances. If you are still here, still resting in this history, this channel exists because of listeners like you. Subscribe if you haven't, so the next chapter of this telling is waiting when you return. The story has more to give, and so do we. Bittersteel did not die on the Redgrass Field. He went into exile with the bones of the man he had loved and the fury of a man who has decided that the world owes him a debt it has not yet paid. He crossed the narrow sea, and on the far side of that sea, in the warm and complicated cities of Essos, he began to build something that would outlast him. Something that still existed 200 years later, when the last echo of the Blackfyre name crossed back into the realm that had exiled it. Aegor Rivers, called Bittersteel, carried the skull of Daemon Blackfyre into exile with him, because some griefs are too specific to be left in someone else's custody, and some debts are too absolute to pay with anything less than the full weight of a life. He had taken it from the field, recovered it in the chaos of the retreat, in the condition of a man who is simultaneously not dead and not entirely alive in the way he had been before, carried it across the sea, wrapped in what remained of his travelling clothes, and it would remain with him for the rest of his life, and then remain with the institution he built after his death, and remain there for 2 centuries, a skull in a war tent, the most specific possible monument to the specific nature of the debt that the Golden Company existed to repay. Let your breathing settle. We have come through the worst of the noise now. The clash of armies, the mourning on the Redgrass Field, the moment of irreversible loss. What follows is quieter in the way that long and difficult things are quieter after their decisive moment has passed. The story moves across the narrow sea. It moves into exile, into the long patience of people who have lost something they are not willing to stop looking for, into the slow work of building something durable out of grief and fury and the particular kind of loyalty that survives defeat, precisely because it was never conditional on winning. Let the quietness of this chapter hold you. There is nothing sharp here, only the long patience of water wearing stone. The crossing of the narrow sea was made with whatever ships could be found at short notice, and whatever men had survived the Redgrass Field and its aftermath and the longer attrition of the retreat. These were not the great lords of the Blackfyre cause. Most of those had been killed or captured and subsequently executed, or had made their peace with the Iron Throne in the days after the battle, surrendering their swords and their fortunes for the chance to return to their castles and their families. The people who crossed with Bittersteel were the ones who had no such return available, younger sons who had committed too publicly to be forgiven, knights who had given personal oaths to Daemon that they could not honour if they accepted Daeron's pardon, men whose estates had already been attainted, men who simply could not bring themselves to bend the knee to the man who had killed someone they loved. They gathered in the years after the Redgrass Field in the free cities of Essos. Tyrosh received many of them first, a city accustomed to receiving political exiles because political exiles tended to arrive with money, skills, and the particular energy of people who are motivated by something more than personal profit. From Tyrosh, they dispersed and reconvened and dispersed again, in the shifting pattern of a community that does not yet know what it is going to become. Bittersteel gave them shape eventually. He had the capacity for this, the organizational instinct, the authority that comes from being the person who is both grieving most intensely and functioning most effectively, the quality that leaders have when they manage to use their own extremity as fuel rather than allowing it to consume them. The Golden Company emerged from this process over the course of several years, named for the gold that paid its contracts, but also, and more essentially, for the motto that Bittersteel gave it, "Beneath the gold, the bitter steel." The name was a statement about what the company was beneath its mercenary surface, beneath the commercial arrangements and the practical necessities of life in exile, beneath the gold that passing clients paid for the services of men who needed to eat and maintain their arms. Beneath all of that, the steel that had been forged on the Redgrass Field, the grief and the purpose and the absolutely uncompromising commitment to the thing that Bittersteel had decided the rest of his life would be in service of. The return, the restoration, the settling of the debt that the battle had incurred. The company's reputation was built on two foundations: the excellence of its soldiers, which was genuine and earned over years of campaigning in Essos, and the absolute reliability of its contracts, which was philosophical as much as it was practical. The Golden Company never broke a contract. This became their defining professional distinction in a field where contract breaking was common enough to be considered merely an elevated form of negotiation. They never broke a contract not because they were incapable of it, but because they had decided that reliability was the currency they were building their return on. That when they eventually brought their swords back to Westeros, the lords who hired them would know exactly what they were getting, which is a kind of trust that is worth more than most things money can buy. Daemon's skull rested in the command tent. This is recorded in multiple accounts from people who visited the Golden Company in various decades of its existence, the specific detail noted because it was striking enough to be memorable to anyone who encountered it. A skull, mounted with a degree of care that indicated it was not a trophy but a relic, identified by those who had been with the company long enough to know its history. Bittersteel did not speak of it openly in most accounts. He did not need to. Its presence said everything that needed to be said about what the Golden Company was and what it was for and what it would remain, beyond his own life and the lives of the men who had followed him out of the Seven Kingdoms. It is worth sitting with the specific quality of this grief for a moment. Not because grief in isolation is instructive, but because this particular grief was doing something unusual. It was being converted, systematically and over years, into an institution. Bittersteel's mourning for Daemon was not simply personal emotion in the way of private losses. It was a public act that was simultaneously organizing a political and military structure around itself, building the exile community into something with procedures and contracts and ranks and a command structure and a reason to get up in the morning. The grief did not disappear, it became load-bearing. It held up the entire enterprise of the Golden Company the way a foundation holds up a castle, invisibly, permanently, and not without cost to the thing doing the holding. In the Seven Kingdoms, meanwhile, Bloodraven was consolidating a position of power that would have been remarkable in any era and was particularly striking given how he was regarded by the court that employed him. He was the king's hand eventually, the second most powerful position in the realm, and he held it for years under different kings, each of whom found him indispensable despite the unease that his presence generated. He was called in those years by the name that had preceded any of his titles, Bloodraven, 1,000 eyes and one. The reference was to his spy network, which by this period had grown to the point where lords in their private chambers were no longer entirely certain that their private chambers were entirely private. Servants, he was said to have noticed, not lords. The people lords never thought about. The relationship between the exile community in Essos and the royalist government in Westeros during these decades was a cold and distant antagonism in which both sides understood very clearly what the other was doing, and neither had the means to stop it. Bloodraven could not reach across the narrow sea to break up the Golden Company. The company was legal in Essos. Its contracts were with parties who had no interest in Westerosi succession politics, and it was not committing any act that gave Daeron's crown a legal basis for action against it. Bittersteel could not bring his company back across the sea until he had assembled the political and military support necessary to make the crossing viable. And assembling that support required time and patience and the survival of the Blackfyre claim. The survival of the claim required the survival of the Blackfyre children, the younger sons who had not fought at the Redgrass Field, who had been in exile since childhood, who had grown up hearing their father's name spoken with a reverence that was itself a kind of political education. These boys knew they were Blackfyres. They knew what Blackfyre meant. They had been raised in the company of men whose identities were organized around a purpose that those men had accepted would define the rest of their lives. Growing up inside that purpose did not leave you neutral about it. It made you the purpose in a very direct sense, made you the continuation of it, the walking, breathing reason that the whole enterprise continued to justify its own existence. The question of what the exile community actually felt in the daily texture of its life is one that the historical record tends not to illuminate very well, because the records of exile are by nature records of absence. They are in the places the exiles came from, not in the places they went. But there are hints. References to Westerosi foods and Westerosi customs maintained in Essos with a care that suggests they were being preserved deliberately rather than simply practiced out of habit. References to children being taught the Westerosi dialect of the common tongue before the Essosi languages of the cities where they were living. References to the specific geography of the Seven Kingdoms being described to people who had never seen it, named and attributed and explained in the way that parents explain the world they came from to children who were born somewhere else, not as history, but as future. Breathe slowly. We are deep in the exile years now, in the long patience between the Redgrass Field and the next time a Blackfyre banner was unfurled. These are the decades in which the Golden Company was becoming itself, becoming the institution rather than simply the grief, and in which Bittersteel was aging slowly into something that was less and less about the original emotion and more about the structure he had built around it. He would live for another 4 decades after the Redgrass Field, 4 decades of contracts kept, 4 decades of a company maintained, 4 decades of a skull in a tent and a name on the tongues of men who had been born after the battle but had been raised to know exactly what it meant. The connection from this period to the world we know from the great stories runs through the institution more than through any individual. The Golden Company that Bittersteel built persisted long after his death, long after the last male Blackfyre died, long after any reason for its existence that was not purely inertia and professional reputation had been removed. It persisted because institutions persist, because the structures that human beings build to outlast their grief are sometimes more durable than the grief itself, because a company of 10,000 men with a reputation and a charter and a tradition is a very hard thing to stop simply because the original reason for it has been altered by events. Jorah Mormont, exiled and disgraced, selling his sword to companies in Essos for the chance of returning to the home he had lost, was walking in a very old pattern. The pattern of the Westerosi exile in the free cities, carrying a name that had become an embarrassment in the place where it used to be an inheritance. There is nothing more you need to carry from this chapter of the telling. Bittersteel has made his grief into something. The Golden Company is built. The skull is in the tent. The younger Blackfyre sons are growing up in the long education of exile, learning what they are supposed to be and feeling, in the way of all children educated into a purpose, the weight of the thing they have inherited. Let that weight settle. Let it find its level. The next rebellion is forming in the long patience of these years, building in the quiet way that all rebellions build before they announce themselves, through conviction and preparation and the slow accumulation of the belief that the moment is approaching. But that moment has not yet arrived, and tonight, this moment, this quiet, this is what there is. Daeron II, in the years after the Redgrass Field, does not appear in the accounts of the period as a man who felt uncomplicated triumph. He had won a war he had not wanted to fight, against a half-brother he had never personally hated, at a cost he had spent years trying to avoid incurring. The accounts of his later reign show a man who administered the realm with characteristic patience and intelligence, and who returned, periodically, to the problem of what the Blackfyre legitimization decree had meant, not as a political question because the political question had been resolved, but as a moral and philosophical one because those questions are not resolved by battles. He completed his Dornish alliance. He continued to govern well. And somewhere in the background of his governance, the exile community across the Narrow Sea was already deciding what to do next. The Golden Company's early years in Essos involved the specific practical problem of sustaining a large military organization on the revenues of mercenary contracts when the organization's ultimate purpose had nothing to do with mercenary contracts. The men who joined the company in its first generation did so largely because they were Westerosi exiles with nowhere else to go, which is a sufficient motivation for enlistment but does not sustain institutional coherence over decades. Bittersteel's solution was to make the institutional coherence itself the primary identity, to make being a member of the Golden Company more immediately real and meaningful than any abstract commitment to a distant political goal. The daily discipline of the company, the shared rituals of drill and march and contract performance, the specific culture of never breaking a contract and always meeting the standard, these were not merely means to the end of returning to Westeros. They were what the men were in the years when returning to Westeros was still very far away. The oath itself was the institution's spine. Sworn upon enlistment and renewed on specific occasions, it bound each member of the company to the twin commitments of professional reliability and political purpose, to keep every contract and to return the rightful claimant to the Iron Throne of the Seven Kingdoms. In the years when the claimant was alive and specific and present in the company's command structure, this dual commitment was easy to hold together. As the years passed and the specific claimants became more remote and the commercial commitments became more immediate, the oath held the two things in tension in a way that required the institution to perform a kind of regular renewal of its own meaning, to remind itself through ritual and story and the skulls in the tent of what it was ultimately for. The Westerosi lords who had fought for Daemon and subsequently accepted Daeron's pardon found themselves in a position that had no comfortable name. They were not quite traitors, the pardon had officially resolved that, but they were not quite trusted either, and the combination produced a social category of the perpetually watched, the perpetually suspect, that their descendants would inherit and that would shape the political landscape of the realm for a generation. Some of them managed this by redoubling their public loyalty, by taking positions of genuine service to the crown and performing them with a diligence that was partly genuine and partly the performance of a man who understands he is being observed. Others managed it by withdrawal, retreating to their castles and their lands and declining as politely as possible the invitations to court that would have required them to be watched more closely than they wished. In the free cities of Essos, the Golden Company drilled and contracted and maintained its oath and waited. In the Seven Kingdoms, Bloodraven watched everything with his 1,000 eyes and won. And in the Blackfyre exile community, a man named Daemon, the second of that name, a son of the first raised to understand exactly what his inheritance meant, was growing into his father's shadow, preparing to test whether the shadow was large enough to cover a war. The second Blackfyre Rebellion was crushed before it managed to fight a single proper battle, exposed at a tournament that should have been nothing more than a local celebration of a minor lord's good fortune, by a hedge knight who stumbled into a conspiracy too large for him to see all of at once, and too dangerous for him to walk away from once he had started to understand its shape. The pretender, Daemon II of that name, was present in the lists wearing the armor of another man, concealing his identity behind borrowed heraldry in a tournament that was ostensibly about the marriage of a minor lord's daughter, but was actually the assembly point for a rebellion that had been years in the planning, funded across the narrow sea, and timed to coincide with a moment of royal vulnerability. It was foiled by bad luck and a very large hedge knight. History does not always make elegant choices about its instruments. Let your thoughts settle. The second Blackfyre Rebellion is a quieter story than the first, contained, discovered before it could fully draw breath, resolved without the scale of slaughter that the Redgrass Field required. It belongs to a series of stories about things that almost happened and then did not, which is its own kind of history, quieter and more instructive in certain ways than the histories of things that did happen. The men who almost made the Second Rebellion are in some ways more interesting than the rebellion they almost made, because they tell us something about the persistence of conviction across 16 years of defeat and exile, and the kind of waiting that converts ambition into something more patient and more dangerous than ambition alone. Rest into this chapter. It is a subtler thing. Let it be subtle. 16 years had passed between the Redgrass Field and the great tourney of White Walls. 16 years in which Bittersteel had built the Golden Company and maintained it, and watched the Blackfyre sons grow and assessed which of them had the qualities that the next attempt would require. Daemon II was the man he settled on, or the man who settled on himself. The historical record is ambiguous on this point, and the assessment was not wrong in the way that assessments tend to be wrong when they overvalue promise. Daemon II had qualities. He had the Blackfyre colouring, the silver hair and the violet eyes, the visible markers of the claim he was making. He had been educated for precisely this role. What he did not have, or did not have in sufficient quantity, was the quality that had made the first demon so dangerous. That particular combination of martial excellence and magnetic force that had made half the realm willing to follow him. He was a man prepared for a role written for someone larger. The tourney at White Walls was the work of Lord Butterwell, a man whose enthusiasm for the Blackfyre cause was driven by a mixture of genuine conviction and the particular logic of a man who has married his daughter to a Blackfyre claimant and therefore has a personal investment in the family's eventual success that goes beyond ideology. The tournament was elaborate and well attended. A prize had been announced substantial enough to attract serious knights from across the realm, which was the point, because a tournament with serious knights from across the realm is a very good place to assess the distribution of Blackfyre sympathy without announcing that you are assessing it. Lords came to compete and to watch and to be seen, and the ones who came because they had been told that there was more to this tourney than jousting came in the knowledge that their presence was itself a kind of communication. Sir Duncan the Tall was there, which was not part of anyone's plan. He was there with his squire, a boy called Egg, who was travelling incognito for reasons that were Egg's own, and who was not, in the context of this particular tournament, entirely what he appeared to be. Duncan was a hedge knight, a large one, exceptionally skilled, with the quality of physical authority that very large and very skilled people carry simply by existing in a space. And he had the hedge knight's specific social position, which is high enough to enter tournaments and low enough to be disregarded in the conversations that lords have when they think they are among their own kind. He heard things. He noticed things. He was, as it turned out, the wrong kind of man to have noticing things at a tournament that depended on nothing being noticed by the wrong person. The events at White Walls unfolded over several days, in the manner of a situation that has been carefully constructed to appear like one thing while being another, and that begins to lose its careful construction the longer it is required to maintain the pretense. Knights competed. Lords dined together and had conversations in slightly lower voices than the conversations they would have had at purely festive gatherings. A false knight in borrowed heraldry entered the lists and competed well enough to suggest that the person inside the armor was not simply someone who had acquired another man's coat, but someone with actual ability behind the borrowed display. The conspiracy was not invisible to everyone in attendance. Conspiracies of this kind are rarely invisible to everyone, which is a structural weakness of all such enterprises. But it was invisible enough, for long enough, to nearly accomplish what it was designed to accomplish. Bloodraven's response when the conspiracy was exposed through the chain of events that Duncan the Tall had inadvertently initiated was swift in the way that responses are swift when the person responding has been watching the situation for long enough to have already decided what to do when the watching was over. Royalist forces appeared at White Walls with a speed that suggested they had not travelled from King's Landing that morning. They had been nearby. Bloodraven had known the tourney was not simply a tourney. He had allowed it to proceed to the point where the evidence was unambiguous and the participants were assembled in a single location, and then he arrived and the option of any response other than surrender was removed by the arithmetic of numbers and preparation. Daemon II was taken prisoner. The rebellion ended before it had technically begun. It is worth sitting with the specific quality of that outcome. The second Blackfyre Rebellion was defeated not by armies on a field, but by intelligence applied at exactly the right moment, by the decision to allow the conspiracy to develop to a point of crystallization before interrupting it, rather than breaking it up prematurely and allowing its participants to scatter and reconvene somewhere harder to watch. This was Bloodraven's method in its clearest expression. He was a man who believed that the most effective power was the power that did not need to exert itself forcefully, because it had arranged its position so carefully that force was simply the final confirmation of an outcome already determined. The Second Blackfyre Rebellion was decided in Bloodraven's intelligence network years before anyone rode to White Walls. The Third Rebellion came 7 years later, in the 219th year after Aegon's conquest, and it was a different kind of affair, a genuine military campaign rather than a conspiracy, organized by Bittersteel from Essos, led by Aegon Blackfyre, another of Daemon's sons, a man who had been raised to this purpose and who had the conviction and the martial ability that the situation required. The Golden Company crossed the narrow sea and landed in force, and what followed was a real war, a campaign that cost real lives on both sides and that required Daeron's successors. He had died by this point, and his line continued through his heirs to meet the invasion with serious military force rather than simply a show of superior intelligence. Aegon Blackfyre was captured. The military campaign was decided against him, the royalist forces proving superior in the field, and in the tradition of captured rebels who have sufficient status to negotiate the terms of their surrender, Aegon surrendered under conditions that included, it is generally understood, certain assurances about his personal safety. These assurances were not kept. The records from the Citadel are careful and somewhat delicate in how they describe what happened to Aegon after his surrender. Phrases like "died while being taken into custody" appear in accounts written by people who were clearly trying to describe a murder without using the word. He was killed after he had put down his arms and accepted the terms offered to him. The evidence of who ordered this points in a direction that the histories of the period acknowledge without quite naming. Bittersteel received the news of Aegon's death and its circumstances in Essos, and what he felt about it is not recorded in ways that preserve the specific quality of his reaction. What is recorded is what he did subsequently, which was to redouble the commitment and the training and the preparation of the Golden Company, and to speak in terms that the men around him found difficult to mistake about what the killing of a man who had surrendered under terms meant for every future engagement in which a Blackfyre standard was flying. It is the particular quality of Bittersteel's position that every betrayal he experienced made him harder, not softer, that the accumulation of losses did not produce resignation, but a kind of calcified fury that burned at a lower and more sustainable temperature than grief, and that sustained him through decades of purpose in the way that a banked fire sustains a forge through a long night. We should probably sit with the moral weight of Aegon's death for a moment before moving past it. The question of whether a rebel king who has surrendered deserves the protections of surrender is a complicated one in the context of medieval warfare, where the rules of such arrangements were followed selectively and violated selectively, and where the definitions of legitimate and illegitimate violence were applied with a flexibility that benefited those with the power to define them. Aegon had raised a rebel army and invaded the Seven Kingdoms. He had caused the deaths of many men. His claim to the protections of surrender rested on the same legal foundations that his entire rebellion had been contesting, and the accounts of the period seem to acknowledge this, there is something in the killing of a man who has put down his weapons that diminishes the person who ordered it, regardless of the justification. Bloodraven was the person who ordered it, or is understood to have been. This would become one of the charges against him years later, when the consequences of his methods had accumulated to the point where the court and the lords of the realm finally decided that the price of having him was higher than the price of losing him. But that reckoning was still some years away. In the period following the Third Rebellion, Bloodraven was at the height of his influence. The indispensable hand, the man whose intelligence network made him the most informed person in the Seven Kingdoms, the pale and quietly terrible figure around whom the governance of the realm organized itself with the efficiency of a mechanism built to very precise tolerances. Breathe. This is a chapter that contains more than its share of the darkness that this history is full of. The darkness of betrayal and murder, and the specific bleakness of wars that do not achieve their objectives and do not cleanly fail either, but simply stop for a while and then resume. You do not need to carry any of it. The weight of the three rebellions is in the past, distributed across centuries, in the earth of the seven kingdoms, and the records of the citadel, and the silent bones of the men who chose sides and paid the cost of choosing. Let it remain there. Let the room hold its quiet. The story is not over, but this chapter of it is settling toward its end. The second and third rebellions tell us something about the nature of causes that survive their first defeat. They grow less spontaneous and more organizational. They lose the quality of love, the mass love that Daemon I had inspired, the almost involuntary devotion that his presence had produced in people who encountered him, and replace it with something more deliberate and more cold. The Golden Company after the Redgrass Field was not the movement that had followed Daemon Blackfyre to the Redgrass Field. It was what that movement became when it was organized by a man who had decided that love without discipline was insufficient, and that what the cause needed was not inspiration but structure. Structure survives defeat in ways that inspiration does not. Structure is what the Third Rebellion had that the Second lacked. Structure was what the Fourth Rebellion would have as well. And structure is what the Golden Company would carry intact into the far future, long after everyone who remembered the first Daemon Blackfyre was dust. The specific question of who Daemon II was, as a person distinct from his father's legend, is one that the historical record handles with the brevity it applies to claimants who did not succeed in asserting their claims. He was educated for the role, as we have noted. He was courageous enough to enter a tournament in borrowed armor, which is not nothing. But the accounts that describe him in the moments of the conspiracy's discovery, in the hours when Bloodraven's forces arrived at White Walls and the option of escape was foreclosed, suggest a young man who had been prepared for triumph and found himself confronting something he had not been prepared for. The specific experience of having the world fail to respond to him in the way it was supposed to. He had been told who he was. He had been told what he deserved. And now, Bloodraven was there with an army, and the tournament was over, and the question of who he was had been answered in a way that left very little room for further discussion. Between the Second and Third Rebellions, the Golden Company spent 7 years in Essos contracts, maintaining its organization and its reputation with the professional consistency that had become its defining characteristic. Bittersteel spent those years assessing the causes of the Second Rebellion's failure and adjusting the planning for the Third accordingly. The adjustments were specific and practical, better coordination between the exile community's internal preparation and the Westerosi lords who had quietly maintained their Blackfyre sympathies, better intelligence about the royalist response capacity, better timing with the invasion planned for a moment of greater political vulnerability than the White Walls conspiracy had tried to exploit. He was a man who learned from defeat, which is the single most important quality a military planner can have, and he applied what he had learned with the cold patience of someone who has accepted that getting it right matters more than getting it done quickly. The Third Rebellion's failure, despite this preparation, tells us something important about the limits of what preparation can achieve when the fundamental political conditions are not aligned with the military plan. Bittersteel could improve the Golden Company's coordination and timing and intelligence. What he could not improve was the basic fact that the realm, in the 219th year after Aegon's conquest, had had more than 2 decades to adjust to Targaryen rule under Daeron's successors, and that the pool of lords who felt strongly enough about the Blackfyre question to risk everything on a third attempt was smaller than it had been in 96, and smaller even than it had been in 212. The cause was not dead, but it was no longer the cause of nearly half the realm. It was the cause of a committed and organized minority, which is a different thing entirely, and the difference shows in the Third Rebellion's military outcomes. Aegon Blackfyre was dead. Bittersteel was alive, older, harder, the grief in him converted into something almost geological in its durability. And in the Seven Kingdoms, Bloodraven sat at the right hand of the throne and looked out through his 1,000 eyes at a realm he had defended with methods that the realm was not entirely grateful for. Something was building in both directions at once. Something in the exile community, something in the court. The Fourth Rebellion was coming, and before it arrived, the man who had made it his life's work to prevent Blackfyre Rebellions would find himself accused of being the greatest threat to the peace he had spent decades maintaining. Brynden Rivers governed the Seven Kingdoms for the better part of 2 decades from the position of King's Hand, and the lords who served under him were never entirely certain, in their honest moments, whether he was the most effective instrument the realm had ever had in that office, or a quiet and persistent danger that successive kings had decided to employ rather than confront. He was pale as old bone, with the red eyes of an albino and a birthmark spreading across the left side of his face in the shape of a blood-red raven in flight. He had one eye, the other had been lost in the first Blackfyre Rebellion, and the one he kept was said to miss very little. He was spoken of in the halls of the great castles the way one speaks of the weather in winter, with the resigned acknowledgement that it was a force present in your life whether you invited its attention or not. Let your breathing slow. We have arrived at a different kind of story now. Not the story of open battle and raised banners, but the story of power exercised in silence, through agents and information, and the long patience of a man who preferred to arrange outcomes before they became visible, rather than responding to them after they had declared themselves. Bloodraven's chapter in the Blackfyre saga is the chapter of the spider and the web, of the way that the world is shaped not only by armies but by the person who knows where the armies are going before they start moving. It is a quieter horror, in certain ways, than the Redgrass Field. Let the quietness of it settle around you. You are resting in a story. Nothing here requires anything from you. The nickname had preceded his influence by years. 1,000 eyes and one, a phrase that had entered the vernacular of the court before Bloodraven had finished assembling the network it described, as if the lords and servants and merchants who coined it had understood what he was building before it was complete. The one was his remaining eye, pale and red and unfailingly attentive. The 1,000 were less easily seen, servants in great households who reported unusual visitors, innkeepers who noticed which lords stopped at their establishments and how long they stayed and who was with them, ravens trained to carry coded messages between stations that existed precisely so that Bloodraven could maintain communications that bypassed the standard channels. He had built this over decades, with the methodical patience of someone who understood that information was a resource that compounded on itself, that knowing one thing made it easier to learn 2 more, and knowing 2 made the path to 4 considerably shorter. The question of what Bloodraven was, underneath the accumulation of offices and networks and half-remembered stories about his sorcerous gifts, is one that his contemporaries struggled with and that the historical record preserves without resolving. He was a great man in the specific sense that great men can be terrible, in the sense that his capacity was genuine and his methods were effective and the things he prevented were real. The Blackfyre Rebellions that did not happen under his watch, the conspiracies he dissolved before they could become movements, the lords he turned from potential rebels into functional loyalists through combinations of pressure and incentive that they were never entirely sure how to refuse. These are the counterfactual events that history does not enumerate because history deals in what occurred and not in what was prevented. Bloodraven's greatest achievements were invisible precisely because they were complete. He had loved Daemon Blackfyre. This is important to say clearly because the relationship between the two half-brothers is sometimes portrayed purely as adversarial, as the pale spy master moving chess pieces against the golden warrior from the very beginning, with no complication of feeling in between. But the accounts from the period before the First Rebellion suggest something more human than that. Genuine affection between two young men who shared a father and a court, and something of the quality that certain siblings develop when their circumstances are strange enough to require mutual recognition of strangeness. Bloodraven had opposed Daemon's rebellion not because he did not care about Daemon, but because he cared about other things more, about the institution of legitimate succession, about the specific person of Daeron II, about the structure of the realm, and having made that choice, he had committed to it with the completeness that characterized everything he did. The Fourth Blackfyre Rebellion came in the 236th year after Aegon's conquest, and it came in the name of Daemon III, another of the Blackfyre line's continuation into the later generations, supported once again by the Golden Company that Bittersteel was still commanding, older now, the grief in him geological, the purpose, if anything, more concentrated for having been maintained for so many decades. The rebellion was better organized than the Third had been, and better funded, and the forces that landed in Westeros had the quality of troops who had been drilling for this specific campaign rather than for the generalized professional excellence of the sellsword market. Bittersteel had not stopped learning. He had not stopped preparing. The Fourth Rebellion was his most sophisticated attempt. It was not sufficient. The Royalist forces, coordinated through Bloodraven's intelligence network with the efficiency that had become Bloodraven's signature, met the invasion before it could establish the momentum that would have been necessary to draw undecided lords to the Blackfyre banner. The campaign was shorter and more decisive than the Third Rebellion, the military outcomes less ambiguous. Daemon III was captured, his forces were scattered, and Aenys Blackfyre, Aegon's son, another of the line, who had been present with the invasion force, attempted to surrender under terms of safe conduct, invoking the same protections that his father had invoked and that his father's safety had not ultimately been protected by. Aenys was killed after his surrender. This time the connection to Bloodraven was less ambiguous than it had been in Aegon's case, and the lords who had been willing to overlook the earlier incident found the second one considerably harder to explain away. There was, among the greater lords of the realm, a feeling that Bloodraven had begun to exceed what his position entitled him to do, that the Hand's office gave him authority to advise and coordinate and implement the king's will, but did not give him authority to execute men who had been promised safety by officers of the king. The argument against him was not that his methods were ineffective. The argument was that methods which were effective but intolerable were still intolerable, and that a realm in which surrendered enemies were killed while their terms of safe conduct were technically still in effect was a realm in which safe conduct meant nothing, which was a realm in which wars did not end. It is worth sitting with that argument for a moment, because it is not a stupid argument, and because it was made by people who were not simply enemies of Bloodraven looking for an excuse to remove him. The lords who brought the charges against him had legitimate grievances. The killing of men who had surrendered under terms undermined the entire framework of honorable surrender that made the management of civil conflict possible, the understanding that defeat was survivable, that accepting terms was a rational choice, that the cost of fighting to the death was not always preferable to the cost of submission. If Bloodraven could kill Blackfyre claimants after they had laid down their arms, the Blackfyre claimants of the future would have no incentive to lay down their arms at all, which meant that future rebellions would be both more desperate and more costly. The lords who charged him were, in this specific respect, right. Bloodraven was arrested and tried before the great lords of the realm. He stood in his trial with the quality of a man who has known that something like this was inevitable for a long time and has made his peace with it, not defiant, not apologetic, not offering anything other than the specific weight of his actual presence, which had always been considerable, and which in this context was almost more than the room could accommodate. The charges were read. He answered them in the way of a man who does not deny what he has done, but declines to treat the doing of it as something requiring apology. The lords deliberated. The sentence was exile to the Night's Watch, which was the traditional resolution for great men who had become impossible to keep and too dangerous to simply execute. He went north. There is not much in the record about the journey, about what it looked like for a man of his position to travel to the Wall and take the Black and become, nominally at least, a steward or ranger of the Night's Watch rather than the Hand of the Seven Kingdoms. He had always been a figure who existed somewhat outside the normal categories, too strange for comfort, too useful to dismiss, too capable for the office to fully contain. The Night's Watch gave him a new version of this position, a man whose authority within the institution was substantial regardless of his official rank, whose intelligence gifts were as relevant at the Wall as they had been at court, whose presence changed the quality of any organization he joined simply by virtue of being present in it. He served at the Wall for years. He rose, eventually, to Lord Commander. And then, at some point during his time there, he passed beyond the Wall into the vast and cold spaces that the Night's Watch existed to watch, and he did not come back. He became, in the records of the Watch, simply absent, not dead, not known to be living, simply gone beyond the point where the Watch's knowledge extended. The records note this in the matter-of-fact way that the Watch recorded everything, without editorial comment, without the kind of language that would suggest the recorder understood the full strangeness of what was being documented. A former Hand of the Seven Kingdoms, one of the most powerful men in the history of the realm, had walked north and disappeared. The record notes it. The record moves on. We know what Bran Stark found eventually in the cold and ancient spaces beyond the Wall. We know what was waiting for him in the cave beneath the weirwood tree. A figure merged into the roots, past the boundary between the human and something older, watching through the eyes of ravens and through the eyes of the trees themselves, seeing everything that the great network of weirwoods could show and many things beyond. The figure in the tree was still Brynden Rivers in some sense. Still the pale man with the red eye and the raven's mark, still possessed of the intelligence that had defined him through his entire human life. But the intelligence had been expanded into something that was less and less about any individual concern and more about the vast and patient work of seeing. 1,000 eyes and one had become something that had no useful number attached to it at all. We should probably sit with the strangeness of that transition for a moment. The man who had spent his life building networks of human informants, teaching servants to observe and merchants to report and ravens to carry coded messages across the width of a continent, had become something that did not need any of those human intermediaries anymore. He was merged with the network directly. He was watching through the wood and through the birds and through the accumulated memory of a tree that had been alive when the children of the forest still walked the earth. It is a transformation so extreme that it strains the ordinary vocabulary of character development, and yet the thread from the young man who calculated his half-brother's probable battle positions before the Redgrass Field to the ancient entity in the weirwood tree is continuous. It is the same gift. It is simply operating at a different scale. Breathe. The long watch that Bloodraven was keeping, the watch that he kept for decades after he passed beyond the Wall, in the roots of an ancient tree in the cold dark beyond the edge of the known world, is still being kept in the time of the great winter we know from the songs. When Bran Stark found him, he was still watching, still knowing. Still occupying the specific position he had occupied his entire life, the observer who operates outside the system he is observing, the intelligence behind the intelligence, the eye that the room doesn't know is watching it. Some things about a person remain constant even when everything else changes. Bloodraven had always been, at his core, a watcher, and in the Weirwood he simply became what he had always been, made absolute. The lords who worked most closely with Bloodraven during his years as King's Hand developed a vocabulary for him that was specific and not entirely complimentary. They described him as effective, they described him as necessary, they described him in the private correspondence that survives in various archives, with the careful language of men who are writing to people they trust while remaining aware that Bloodraven has agents in the households of people they trust. He was not hated in the way of officials who are simply incompetent or cruel. He was regarded with the specific unease of people who understand that the person they are dealing with knows more than they do about everything relevant to their own situation, and who have accepted this imbalance not because they are comfortable with it, but because there is no mechanism for resolving it short of removing the person who holds it. Several of them tried to work on that problem. Bloodraven, through means they did not entirely understand, always seemed to know when they had started trying. The network that Bloodraven maintained through these years was not static. It grew and adapted in response to the information environment it was operating in, adding nodes where the flow of significant information required them and retiring agents who had become compromised or obsolete. The result, by the time of the Fourth Rebellion, was something that had no historical precedent in the Seven Kingdoms, an intelligence apparatus of genuine national scope, not dependent on the personal relationships and informal communication channels that had previously constituted the entirety of a hand's information advantage, but built as a system, with redundant pathways and verification mechanisms and the specific resilience of organizations that have been designed to function even when individual components fail. It was Bloodraven's life's work in the same sense that the Golden Company was Bittersteel's, an institution that expressed his particular genius in its purest and most organized form. The trial that followed his arrest was, by the accounts of those who observed it, a remarkable event in the specific way that events are remarkable when the people involved are too sophisticated to pretend they do not understand what is happening. The lords who sat in judgment had decided, collectively, that Bloodraven's methods had crossed a line that the realm could not accept being crossed again. Bloodraven had decided, apparently, that defending himself at length was less important than managing the outcome. He spoke briefly. He did not deny what he had done. He did not offer the kinds of justifications that would have required the lords to either accept them or explicitly reject them, which would have required them to articulate the principles they were applying in terms that they did not want applied to their own future conduct. He simply accepted the sentence with the quality of a man who has known this moment was coming and has been prepared for it for years. The history is deeper than any single telling. If you are resting in this story and want to be here when we continue, subscribe. The next chapter will be waiting for you. Bloodraven was gone beyond the wall, beyond the ordinary scope of the living world. The Golden Company was still in Essos, carrying its oath and its skull and its 10,000 trained men. The male Blackfyre line still existed in the form of a man who would become the most grotesque figure in its history, a man whose claim to the name Blackfyre rested on having killed everyone else who might have contested it, and whose ambition was large enough and strange enough to draw 9 unlikely allies to a common cause that would eventually resolve in blood on the stepstones. His name was Maelys, and he was not like the others. Maelys Blackfyre was the last male of his line, and he had arrived at that position through an act so extreme that even his supporters declined to discuss it openly in the years that followed. He was said to have been born with the vestige of his twin brother fused to his body, a growth on his shoulder or neck that the accounts describe with varying degrees of anatomical specificity and uniform unease, and he had removed it himself, tearing away the remnant of the life that had failed to fully separate from his at birth. The story may have been exaggerated by his enemies, who had reasons to make him seem monstrous. It may have been exaggerated by his supporters, who found the image of a man who consumed his twin to be a demonstration of exactly the kind of ruthless extremity that the Blackfyre cause required after 5 decades of failed rebellions. What is certain is that the name Maelys the Monstrous was not ironic, and that everyone who knew him seemed to have found the name apt. Let your thoughts settle. We are approaching the end of the Blackfyre line now, the last chapter of a story that began in a death chamber 260 years after Aegon's conquest and will close, in this telling, on a different field, in a different sea, with a different kind of violence that is in certain ways the most final violence that the line ever encountered. The end of a bloodline is a specific kind of quietness, not the quietness of peace, not the quietness of resolution, but the quietness of something that has been trying to assert itself for a very long time and finally cannot. Let that quietness settle around you. We are near the end of this part of the story, and the end of any story, even a violent one, carries its own specific rest. The years between the Fourth Rebellion and the War of the Ninepenny Kings were the years in which the Golden Company completed its transformation from a grief-driven exile institution into something that had outlasted its original grief and was beginning to need a reason to continue that was separate from the specific emotional charge that Bittersteel had given it. Bittersteel had died in the 241st year after Aegon's conquest, having spent more than 40 years after the Redgrass Field in the patient and furious work of maintaining what he had built. He had seen 3 rebellions fail. He had not stopped planning a 4th. He died, apparently, still in the middle of planning it, which is perhaps the most characteristic possible death for a man whose fury had been converting itself into purpose for so long that the conversion had become his fundamental condition. His skull joined demons in the Golden Company's war tent. This is recorded in the accounts and mentioned with the same matter-of-fact quality that the accounts use to record most things about the Golden Company. The slightly detached observation of people who have been in proximity to this institution long enough that its specific customs no longer seem strange. 2 skulls in a tent. The founder and the man whose death the company had been founded to avenge. They would be joined in the decades that followed by others, the remains of each Blackfyre pretender as the line continued to produce them, kept in the custody of the institution that their family had created to serve their cause. It is a specific kind of memorial. It is the kind of memorial that only exists when the grief behind it has been so thoroughly institutionalized that the institution and the grief have become indistinguishable. Maelys came to prominence in the Blackfyre exile community in the years after the Fourth Rebellion's failure, and his rise was not a gradual or gentle one. He was physically enormous in the accounts, the kind of size that puts people in mind of something other than ordinary human scale, augmented by the specific qualities of ferocity and willingness to use his size without restraint that made him genuinely frightening rather than simply impressive. He disposed of whatever remaining male Blackfyre claimants stood between him and the position of senior claimant through means that the accounts are coy about, but that the pattern of the period makes fairly clear. By the time he was in a position to make his play for the Iron Throne, he was the only Blackfyre male left to make it. He had simplified the succession question by the direct method. The Band of Nine was Maelys's instrument, though calling it his instrument overstates how much control any single member of the alliance had over a coalition of 9 ambitious and dangerous individuals who had each agreed to help the others achieve goals that would require them to trust each other only as long as it was profitable to do so. The 9 were mercenary captains and petty kings and ambitious lords of various kinds, drawn together in Essos by the specific logic of people who have decided that the existing order is an obstacle to their ambitions and that cooperating to remove it, at least initially, is more efficient than competing to remove it individually. Maelys was one of the 9. The goal that his participation was meant to achieve was the Iron Throne of the Seven Kingdoms. The other members of the alliance had their own goals, which Maelys had agreed to support in exchange for their support of his. The War of the Ninepenny Kings began in the 260th year after Aegon's conquest, when the Band of Nine moved against the Stepstones, the chain of islands between Essos and the shores of Westeros, a strategically significant location from which an invasion of the Seven Kingdoms could be launched, and from which the commerce of the Narrow Sea could be taxed or disrupted. The Westerosi response was more rapid and more militarily significant than the Band of Nine seems to have anticipated. The realm sent forces of genuine quality, knights and lords who arrived with the specific energy of men who have been waiting for a clear enemy to fight and have finally been given one. Among those forces were men who would become significant figures in the generation that followed, men who were young knights then, and would be great lords in the years of winter. We should sit with that for a moment, the youth of the men who fought at the Stepstones. Sir Barristan Selmy was there, a young knight whose reputation was already substantial and who would emerge from the Stepstones campaign with the specific distinction of having done the single most individually significant act of the entire war. Tywin Lannister was there in the command councils, learning something about the relationship between military organization and political outcome that he would apply to devastating effect in later decades. These are men who would become, in the years that followed, the senior figures of the age we know from the great stories, the grey-haired lords and the white-cloaked knights who stood in the background of the Winter Wars, carrying the weight of decades of earlier experience. At the Stepstones, they were young, and the thing they were young for was the end of the Blackfyre line. Sir Barristan Selmy fought Maelys Blackfyre in single combat on the Stepstones, in a confrontation that the accounts describe with varying degrees of dramatic enhancement but consistent agreement on the essential outcome. Maelys was larger. Maelys was ferocious in the way of men who had built their authority on the physical expression of their ferocity, and who had no capacity for the kind of strategic retreat that a purely tactical engagement might have suggested. Barristan was faster. Barristan was technically precise in the way of men who have spent their entire lives studying the discipline of sword work as an art, rather than simply as an instrument of destruction. The fight was what fights are when one person has certain advantages and the other person has different ones, a question of which set of advantages could be made to tell before the other set could answer them. It is worth pausing on that moment, the moment when Maelys Blackfyre fell on the Stepstones, the last male of the line going down under the sword of a young knight who would spend the next 40 years as the greatest living exemplar of the chivalric tradition, and because it is the end of something, and endings deserve more attention than they usually receive in the telling of stories. The Blackfyre Rebellion had begun with a magnificent man who had inspired half the realm to follow him. It ended with a man who had consumed his own twin and had to be killed by single combat because the ordinary mechanisms of military defeat were insufficient to remove him from a field he had decided to hold. What the line had been at its beginning and what it was at its end are so different from each other that calling them the same thing requires the act of imagination that all historical continuity eventually demands. The male Blackfyre line was extinguished at the Stepstones. This is the historical record summary of what Barristan Selmy's sword accomplished on that day, stated with the brevity that the Citadel applied to definitive outcomes. The female line survived. There were daughters and granddaughters of various Blackfyre claimants who had married into families in Essos and elsewhere, but the specific claim that required a male Blackfyre to carry it was gone. The sword, Blackfyre itself, had been lost at some point. Exactly when and how the blade passed out of the family's custody is uncertain, and its current location in the time of the great stories is unknown, which is its own kind of haunting. A Valyrian blade loose in the world without a hand to hold it or a history to belong to. The Golden Company survived Maelys's death. This is perhaps the clearest evidence of how thoroughly Bittersteel had succeeded in transforming grief into institution. The company he built continued to function, to accept contracts, to maintain its reputation and its oath and its 10,000 soldiers, even after the last person the oath had been designed to serve was dead. It is an entity that outlasted its purpose and found that the structure was sufficient to sustain itself in the absence of the purpose, that the habit of existence is sometimes more durable than the reason for existing, and that institutions, once built to a sufficient scale, tend to find new reasons to continue rather than simply stopping when the original reason has been removed. Breathe. The War of the Ninepenny Kings ended. The stepstones were secured. The young knights went home with the specific gravity of men who have done something they will carry all their lives. Not a comfortable gravity, not the gravity of uncomplicated triumph, but the weight of having been present at a moment that the world will remember. Barristan Selmy would spend the next 50 years as the greatest knight of his age, serving kings and protecting them, and watching the world they inhabited become gradually unrecognizable from the world he had been young in. He would remember the stepstones. He would remember Maelys. And somewhere in the golden tents of the company that bore the name, the skull of the Monstrous would be added to the collection. The last Blackfyre king, the last male of the line, remembered in the same way as all the others. The connection from the stepstones to the Great Winter is a connection made through specific people who were present in both places. Barristan Selmy, who killed Maelys Blackfyre on the stepstones in the 260th year after Aegon's conquest, was still alive in the time of the Great Winter. Ancient, extraordinary, still technically the greatest living swordsman in Westeros by the judgment of those who knew what they were looking at. He served Daenerys Targaryen in her campaign in Essos. He stood at her side in the councils where the future of her claim was debated. He was, in other words, the living connection between the end of the Blackfyre threat and the beginning of the Targaryen restoration. A single man who had been present at both, carrying the whole long arc of the century in his memory and his scarred body, and the specific way he held a sword. There is nothing more you need to hold from this chapter. The Monstrous is dead. The male line is ended. What remains of the Blackfyre story moves through institutions and through whispers and through a question that will eventually be asked again in a different form by different people about a different claimant whose name and bloodline are both uncertain in ways that would have been familiar to anyone who had paid attention to the preceding century of Blackfyre politics. The story is not over, but this chapter of it has found its rest. Let that rest be yours as well. The morning on the stepstones is very far away now. What remains is very quiet. The Band of Nine's internal dynamics during the Stepstones campaign were not the smooth coordination that their alliance agreement had implied when they had made it in Essos. 9 ambitious people with 9 different sets of goals are 9 different gravitational pulls on any shared enterprise, and the Stepstones campaign revealed the fault lines in the alliance with the precision that adversity tends to apply to all human agreements made under more comfortable circumstances. Some members of the Nine were more committed to Maelys's Westerosi ambitions than others. Some had achieved their own objectives early in the campaign and saw diminishing reason to continue exposing themselves to the Westerosi military response. The alliance held long enough to give Maelys a genuine shot at the objective. It did not hold long enough to guarantee him success when the shot encountered serious resistance. The Westerosi force that met them at the Stepstones was fighting with something that the mercenary captains and petty kings of the Band of Nine found difficult to account for in their tactical planning: the specific motivation of men defending what they considered to be their home. The knights and soldiers sent from Westeros were fighting not for pay and not for the abstract political principle of Targaryen legitimacy, but for the concrete and immediate proposition that these islands, and by extension the kingdom they protected, were theirs, and that the Band of Nine's presence was an intrusion that needed to be removed. This motivation does not make armies invincible. It has limits, and those limits show when the fighting is prolonged and the costs accumulate. But in the initial engagements of the Stepstones campaign, it produced a quality of commitment that the mercenary side of the conflict found difficult to match with professional calculation alone. The aftermath of the Stepstones campaign settled back into the ordinary rhythms of the Seven Kingdoms with the specific speed that military victories enable when the threat they resolve is genuinely terminal. There was no exile community to watch afterward, no Bittersteel to assess the failure and begin planning the next attempt, no surviving male Blackfyre to anchor the cause in a living person. The threat was over because the person who constituted it was dead, and for the first time in 64 years, there was no Blackfyre pretender in Essos preparing for the next campaign. The realm was free of a specific anxiety that had been present in various intensities since the day the unworthy king rasped his final command. The freedom had a particular quality to it that the lords of the Seven Kingdoms do not seem to have fully appreciated at the time, because freedoms from long-standing anxieties are difficult to perceive clearly until enough time has passed that the anxiety has faded from living memory. The Stepstones themselves, those rocky islands scattered across the approach to the narrow sea, did not care about the Blackfyre name, or the Targaryen succession, or the oath of the Golden Company. They had been contested and reconquered and held and lost across centuries by pirates and free companies and rival city-states, because their value was purely strategic, the control of the passage between two continents. What happened on those islands in the 260th year after Aegon's conquest was, from the island's perspective, simply another episode in a very long series of episodes. The history that matters, the history of the Blackfyre line ending, was being made by the people on those islands. The islands themselves were simply the place where it happened to occur. Maelys the Monstrous was dead. The last male Blackfyre was gone. The Golden Company had lost its purpose and had not yet found its replacement. And in the free cities of Essos, a Lysaene eunuch named Varys and a Myrish merchant named Illyrio were beginning to have conversations about the future of a dynasty, and a boy with silver gold hair, who had not yet been given a name the world would recognize, was growing up somewhere, learning to be whatever the people around him needed him to become. Long after the last male Blackfyre died on the Stepstones, the Golden Company kept its oath, and when a boy with silver gold hair and violet eyes appeared in the orbit of their leadership, traveling under the name Young Griff, and kept in ignorance of his claimed identity until the time was judged appropriate for the revelation, the company made a decision that its founders would have understood as the fulfillment of what they had been building toward, even if the name attached to the claim was no longer the name they had originally sworn to serve. The story they were told was that he was Aegon Targaryen, son of Prince Rhaegar, smuggled out of King's Landing as an infant before Robert Baratheon's rebellion reached its conclusion, kept hidden for 16 years in the careful custody of men who believed his survival justified any cost. The story, as with all stories in the Blackfyre tradition, was not quite that simple. Let your breathing slow and settle. We are in the final chapter of the Blackfyre story now, and it is the strangest chapter of all, a chapter that does not take place in the Seven Kingdoms but in the intricate free cities of Essos, in narrow streets and chandlers' shops and the grand villas of prosperous merchants, in conversations between people who had been planning something enormous for years and were only now beginning to put the pieces into motion. It is a chapter about identity and legitimacy, and the question of whether a claim can be true if the person making it believes it with complete sincerity, even if the foundations of that belief were laid by other people for reasons that the claimant does not fully understand. Rest into this. Let the complexity of it wash over you like water over stone. The Golden Company had survived the death of Maelys Blackfyre with the specific organizational durability of an institution that has developed its own momentum independent of the cause that originally generated it. Its 10,000 soldiers were still there, still drilling, still accepting contracts in Essos with the professional precision that Bittersteel had instilled. Its captains were still bound by the oath that never broke a contract. Its war tent still contained the skulls of the men the company had been built to serve. But the specific political purpose, the restoration of a Blackfyre claimant to the Iron Throne of the Seven Kingdoms, had been rendered obsolete by the simple biological fact that there were no more male Blackfyres to restore. The company was a vessel without a cargo. It would not remain that way for long. Varys and Illyrio Mopatis were men of considerable sophistication and considerable patience, which are exactly the qualities that a conspiracy of the scale they were managing requires. Varys had risen, through means that his history in Westeros does not fully illuminate, to the position of Master of Whisperers at the Iron Throne of the Baratheon dynasty, the official spymaster of a king who had won his throne through rebellion, serving in the intelligence role that Bloodraven had served in an earlier age, with the same fundamental commitment to gathering information and the very different fundamental question of whose interests that information was actually serving. Illyrio was a Pentoshi merchant of great wealth and greater influence, a man who had made himself essential to so many different parties that his loyalty was the most expensive thing he possessed, and he sold it accordingly. They had a boy. The boy travelled under the name Griff's son, young Griff, and had been educated by Jon Connington, a former hand of the heiress Targaryen court who had been exiled after his military failure in the war that cost the dynasty everything, and who had spent his exile in the specific condition of a man who believes that the failure that defined him was recoverable, given sufficient time and the right circumstances. Jon Connington loved Rhaegar Targaryen with the particular love that certain people develop for those they admire beyond the ability of admiration to contain, the love that does not announce itself and does not act on itself and lives in the specific ache of service to something larger than any individual feeling. He had failed Rhaegar. He had been given the chance to serve Rhaegar's son. He had accepted the chance with everything he had left. The boy was taught everything. Languages, High Valyrian, the common tongue, several Essosi dialects, history, strategy, swordsmanship, the management of people who were performing an assessment of you at every moment, even when they were pretending to simply be in the room. He was taught how to be royal, which is a specific and learnable skill that is neither simple performance nor simple character, but a combination of both, maintained across years of development until it becomes genuine rather than performed. He had the Targaryen silver-gold hair and the violet eyes that the coloring requires. He had a story, the story of his survival, the rescue, the long hiding, that he had been told from childhood in the way that all foundational stories are told, as truth, not as narrative. Here is the question that the books leave open, and that the world of ice and fire does not answer before it reaches its current edge of the telling. Is he who he says he is? The story he was given is coherent. It is specific. It has named participants and verifiable dates and a chain of custody that, while not public record, is at least internally consistent. John Connington believes it. The Golden Company captains who agreed to support it believe it, or have decided that the question is less important than the answer it generates. But the Golden Company was founded to serve the Blackfyre claim, and the person who arranged this boy's education and upbringing and presentation to the world is Illyrio Mopatis, a man whose connections to the Blackfyre bloodline through various female line marriages are at minimum worth noting. The whispers exist. They have always existed in the circles that pay close enough attention to the details. It is worth sitting with that uncertainty rather than resolving it, because the uncertainty is the point. The Blackfyre question at its core was never about facts. It was about interpretation. Daemon Blackfyre's claim was factually real. He was legitimate, the decree was legally issued, but the interpretation of that fact was contested from the moment the decree was made. This boy's claim is factually stated. He is who he is told he is, but the interpretation of that statement is precisely what the historical pattern of the preceding century makes it impossible to take entirely at face value. A claimant to the Targaryen legacy, supported by the Golden Company, organized by a man with possible Blackfyre connections, arriving in Westeros at a moment of maximum instability. The pattern is familiar. The name attached to it is different. Whether the name is true is the question that the story has not yet answered. He came to Westeros in the years of winter. The Golden Company landed in the Stormlands with the efficiency of a professional force that had been planning the specific logistics of this crossing for years, not months, and established a foothold with a speed that surprised even the people who had been told to expect them. The Stormlands castles that opened their gates to him did so for various reasons. The power vacuum left by the War of the Five Kings, the specific dynamics of local lords whose calculations about survival had shifted enough to make the risk of supporting a new claimant seem preferable to the risk of remaining loyal to a crown that could not protect them. He moved quickly. He spoke well. He had the quality of someone who has been educated to lead from childhood and has absorbed that education completely. We should probably sit with the strangeness of watching the Blackfyre pattern repeat itself in new form, because strangeness deserves its moment before it is consumed by familiarity. Here was a claimant of uncertain legitimacy, backed by the Golden Company and by men with complicated motives, arriving in Westeros during a succession crisis to contest the throne with the argument that the existing power was insufficient. The argument was different from Daemon's, a claim of direct Targaryen descent rather than a rival Targaryen reading, but the structure underneath it was identical. A beautiful young man with the right coloring and the right bearing and the support of powerful backers and the willingness of lords who had reasons to prefer an alternative. The Blackfyre inheritance had always been as much about the pattern as about the name, and Daenerys Targaryen was across the sea, building her own claim from a different direction, with dragons and armies and the specific quality of a person who has earned her position through years of difficulty that no one engineered for her benefit. She was told of him eventually. She was not, by the accounts available, pleased. Another claimant. Another person with a face that resembled her family's history and a story that required accepting and a set of backers whose motives deserved examination. Another contest she had not been warned to expect. She had spent her life being the last Targaryen. The possibility that she was not, that the last Targaryen might be someone else, or that there might be two of them with different claims and different supporters and different ideas about what the throne was for, was a complication that arrived at exactly the moment when she could least afford complications. The parallel between Daenerys' position and Daeron II's is not perfect, but it is illuminating. Daeron was the legitimate heir confronted by a claimant who looked more like a king than he did. Daenerys is the last surviving certain Targaryen confronted by a claimant whose identity she cannot verify and whose arrival has been orchestrated by people with agendas she does not have full access to. In both cases, the question is whether the legitimate holder of the claim can hold it against the force of the alternative. In both cases, the people who have organized the alternative have spent years, possibly decades, positioning their pieces for exactly this confrontation. In both cases, the resolution is not certain. The Blackfyre pattern does not guarantee any particular outcome. It only guarantees that the question will be asked. What it does to the person who has to answer it is another matter entirely. Breathe. Let your mind release the uncertainty that the open question creates, because uncertainty is exactly what you do not need in this moment. The resolution, whatever it turns out to be, will find its own telling in its own time. Tonight, the story is sufficient unto itself, the long pattern of it, the century of rebellion and exile and return, the human beings who moved through it and gave it the specific texture of lived experience that makes history something other than simply a sequence of events. You have followed it all the way from Aegon the Unworthy's death chamber to the shores of the Stormlands. You have been a witness to something that most tellings rush past in the interest of arriving at conclusions. This telling has preferred the interior of the story over its summary, and the interior is always where the truth is. The thread that runs through this chapter and back through all the others is ultimately a thread about what people are willing to do for a name and what a name is willing to do for people who carry it. The Golden Company gave everything to a name for more than a century. The name was Blackfyre. Whether the boy in the Stormlands carries that name or the name he was given is a question whose answer lives in a place the record has not yet opened. But the pattern lives regardless of the answer. The Blackfyre pattern is not a genealogy. It is an argument. And arguments have a way of being made by whoever needs to make them, regardless of what the documents say about their original authorship. There is nothing more you need from this chapter. The boy has landed. The company has kept its oath, or the form of its oath. The Stormlands are deciding. And across the narrow sea, a silver-haired queen with 3 dragons is beginning to understand that the world she is returning to is more complicated than the world she was told she was returning to, which is exactly what the world has always been in this story and in every other one. More complicated than the telling suggests, more human than the legend requires. And more important for all of that than any simple summary of it could adequately convey. John Connington's relationship with the boy he was raising was the relationship of a man who has organized his entire remaining life around a single purpose and who has therefore invested everything he has, every quality of care and intelligence and devotion that he possesses into the object of that purpose. He taught the boy rigorously. He corrected him constantly. He pushed him towards standards that the ordinary education of a royal child would not have demanded, because the situation they were in was not ordinary, and the standards required were correspondingly higher. He was, by the accounts of those who observed him with the boy, an excellent teacher in the specific way of teachers who care more about the quality of what they are producing than about the immediate comfort of the person being produced. The boy was not spoiled. The boy was prepared. And preparation, in John Connington's understanding of the world, was the highest form of love available to someone in his position. The Golden Company's decision to support this particular claimant required its captains to resolve a significant internal tension. The company had been founded to serve the Blackfyre claim, and this claimant was being presented not as a Blackfyre, but as a Targaryen. The resolution, when it came, appears to have been more pragmatic than principled. The company needed a purpose. This claimant provided a purpose. The purpose was at least structurally similar to the original one, and the alternative was to continue in Essos indefinitely as a pure mercenary enterprise with no ultimate goal beyond the perpetuation of its own existence. Whether the captains who made this decision believed the claimant's story, or believed that it did not matter, or believed something in between, a possibility that the story was probably not entirely true but was true enough to serve is not a question the surviving accounts answer directly. What they answer is that the decision was made, and that once made, it was made with the complete commitment that the Golden Company applied to every contract it accepted. The speed with which the early stages of the landing succeeded surprised even the people who had planned them, which is the specific quality of success that well-prepared operations sometimes achieve when they encounter a political environment that is more fragile than it appeared from the outside. The War of the Five Kings had left the Stormlands in the specific condition of a region that has been fought over and bled over and promised to multiple parties simultaneously, and whose lords have consequently developed a sophisticated cynicism about the reliability of any guarantee offered by any of the existing claimants to power. Into this cynicism came a young man with the right colouring and the right bearing and the right backing and the specific quality of someone who has been educated to inspire confidence, and found that cynical lords offered a sufficiently compelling alternative at a sufficiently desperate moment could move faster than the people who had underestimated their desperation had expected. The question of what the Seven Kingdoms were returning to, what kind of realm would emerge from the winter wars and the long night and the competing claims of the living and the dead, was a question that the Blackfyre pattern had been preparing in its own way for a century. Every time the realm had been asked to choose between competing visions of legitimate authority, it had learned something about what authority was and where it came from and what it cost to maintain it. The lessons had been expensive. Whether they had been absorbed was the question that the Age of Winter was in the process of testing, in the only way that such questions are ever conclusively tested, through events whose outcomes are not known in advance. The boy with the silver-gold hair had come to Westeros. Whether he was who he said he was, the answer to that question lived in a place that only the winter would eventually reach. And the winter, as everyone in the Seven Kingdoms understood by this point, was here. The long summer was over. The time for certainties had passed. What remained was the cold, the dark, and the questions that civilizations ask when they are standing at the edge of something very large and very final. Questions about what they are and what they were, and whether what they were is sufficient to carry them forward into whatever comes next. The name Blackfyre has not been spoken aloud in a great court of the Seven Kingdoms for a generation. The word is not written on any banner that flies over any castle in the realm. The sword that gave the name to the dynasty is lost somewhere, in some vault, in some collection, in some darkness that the current age has not yet opened. And yet the questions that the name attached to, the questions about who is the rightful ruler, about what blood confers and what acknowledgement confirms, about whether the law makes the king or the king makes the law, these questions have not been silenced with the name. They persist in the way that questions always persist when they have been embedded deep enough in the structure of a civilization, as if the asking of them long enough and loud enough writes them into the stone of the institutions that were supposed to answer them. Let your breathing slow to something deeper than breathing usually goes. We have come a very long way together through a very old story, from a death chamber in the 184th year after Aegon's conquest, all the way to the shores of the Stormlands in the age of winter and dragons, and the return of old things that the world had decided were gone for good. You are close to the end of this telling. Not the end of the story. That story is still unfolding in the age the songs will eventually record, but the end of this particular passage through it, this slow and careful traversal of nearly 100 years of rebellion and exile and the patient, grinding work of people who refused to accept that they had already lost. Let the end approach at its own pace. It is in no hurry, and neither are you. The legacy of the Blackfyre Rebellions is not simply military or dynastic, it is philosophical. It is the introduction into the political tradition of the Seven Kingdoms of a question that the tradition was not previously required to answer. What makes a rightful ruler? Before the Unworthy King's legitimization decree, the answer was available, if not simple. Blood and birth and the formal acknowledgement of the succession, verified by the Citadel's records and the Lord's oaths of fealty. After the decree, the answer was complicated. A rightful ruler needed blood, yes, but whose blood in which combination and acknowledged by whom, at what moment and in what circumstances and under what degree of duress? The decree had revealed the arbitrariness at the center of a system that had worked precisely because its arbitrariness was not visible. There is something worth sitting with in that revelation, the way in which the Unworthy's act exposed the contingency that all stable systems contain but require their stability to conceal. Daeron II was a good king. Daemon Blackfyre may have been a better potential king in certain specific ways, but the system of monarchy does not function on the basis of who would govern best. It functions on the basis of who is acknowledged as the rightful governor, and acknowledgement is a social fact, not a natural one. It requires agreement. When the agreement breaks down, when a dying king issues a decree that contradicts the settled understanding of who the heir is, the system does not have a mechanism for resolving the contradiction except through the same force that established the original agreement, the force of arms, the weight of armies, the ultimate grammar of people who are willing to die for a particular answer to the question. The 5 rebellions were the 7 kingdoms working through a contradiction that should not have been introduced and could not be removed without cost. Each rebellion was the Blackfyre faction testing whether the realm had changed enough, whether the political conditions had shifted sufficiently, whether the specific claimant was impressive enough and the Golden Company prepared enough and the moment propitious enough to resolve the contradiction in their favor. Each rebellion failed. The royalist side won every military engagement eventually. But winning militarily does not resolve a philosophical contradiction, it only defers it. The contradiction is still there, in the surviving female Blackfyre lines and in the questions about succession that the War of the 5 Kings opened in a different form and under different names. Bloodraven is watching. This must be said directly, and without flinching from its strangeness, because it is true in the way that things are true in the world of ice and fire, in the specific, concrete, cosmological sense that the Weirwood network operates in, that the children of the forest understood, that Bran Stark is learning in his time in the cave beyond the wall. The pale man who began as a royal bastard and became a spy master, and became a hand, and became a lord commander, and became something for which there is no good word is still there, in the roots of the ancient tree, watching through whatever eyes the tree offers him. The Blackfyre Rebellions, every one of them, were watched by someone. The last one that Bloodraven managed as a human actor was the 4th. The fifth and everything after it he watched from the weirwood, from the other side of the distinction between the living and whatever he has become. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of that continuity for a longer moment than it usually receives. The same consciousness, the same will, the same intelligence, the same commitment to the preservation of something that he decided mattered more than the particular claims of any individual person, has been present and observing through the entire span of the Blackfyre saga and beyond it, into the Age of Winter and the return of the Others and the Game of Thrones that Westeros is playing at the edge of an existential threat it barely understands. Bloodraven in the weirwood is still the watcher, still the counter-move, still the intelligence operating at one remove from the event, shaping outcomes through access to information that no one else possesses. The scale has changed. The fundamental approach has not. Jon Snow does not know about the Blackfyre Rebellions in the way that a historian knows about them. But Jon Snow is living inside the structural question that the Blackfyre Rebellions asked and failed to answer. He was born legitimate, raised as a bastard, acknowledged as nothing, and carries in his blood a claim to the Iron Throne that he was never told he had. He is the inversion of Daemon Blackfyre, where Daemon was made legitimate by decree after being born outside the law. Jon was born legitimate within the law and made illegitimate by the secrecy that was meant to protect him. Both of them are people whose real identity is not their apparent identity. Both of them are people whose claim depends on facts that the acknowledged record does not reflect. And both of them are people about whom the realm will eventually be required to decide what it believes, not what the documents say, not what the law provides for, but what it chooses to recognize as true. Daenerys Targaryen is the last certain Targaryen, in the sense that her claim is documented and uncontested by the historical record and supported by the specific and undeniable evidence of 3 living dragons. And yet even she, even the person with the most unambiguous claim to the dynasty's legacy, must fight for the throne rather than simply inherit it. Because the inheritance was interrupted and the interruption was thorough, and the people currently occupying the seats of power in the 7 kingdoms have no intention of moving without being made to move. She is legitimate. She is also, as the Blackfyre Rebellions taught anyone paying attention, discovering that legitimacy is a beginning rather than a conclusion, the beginning of the argument, not its resolution. We should probably sit with that for a moment, the relationship between legitimacy and power, between having the right and being able to exercise it. The Blackfyre Rebellions were, at their core, an extended demonstration that having the legal right to the throne and having the actual throne are 2 different things that require 2 different things to obtain. Daemon Blackfyre's legitimization decree gave him the right in one interpretation and not the other. The sword in his hand gave him a kind of power, but not the kind that survives the Redgrass Field. Daenerys has the legitimacy and the dragons and the armies, and still must negotiate with a world that has reorganized itself around her absence, and is not certain it wants to reorganize again around her return. The question the Blackfyre Rebellions raised has not been simplified by time. It has only acquired more dimensions. Let your breathing slow further now. The telling is nearing its end, and the end of a telling has its own particular quality, the quality of something that has been held at a certain pitch of attention for a long time, beginning to release that pitch, beginning to allow the listener back to the surface of ordinary rest. You have been very deep in this story. You have been in death chambers and on battlefields and in the war tents of exile companies and in the roots of ancient trees in the cold dark beyond the wall. All of those places are very far away now. They have always been very far away. They are 800 years away, or some fraction of that, or in the case of the weirwood, no distance at all, but a different kind of distance than the ones measured in miles. The Blackfyre Rebellions tell us, ultimately, something that stories about legitimacy always tell us when we follow them all the way to their roots, that the foundations of the systems we live in are more human than we usually let ourselves acknowledge. The system says the king is the king because of birth and blood and the formal acknowledgement of the succession. But the birth and the blood and the acknowledgement are all human things made by human beings, changeable by human decisions, vulnerable to human mistakes. Aegon the Unworthy made one mistake, one decision in one moment on one dying night, and it took a century of war to exhaust the consequences of it. Not because the mistake was large in itself, because the system it damaged was built to look like something larger than human, and the gap between that appearance and the reality was exactly the size of the catastrophe. Let the room hold you now. Whatever surface is beneath you, bed, chair, the particular comfortable weight of wherever you chose to rest tonight, let it hold you fully. There is nothing remaining of the Blackfyre story that requires your attention. The rebellions are over. The exiles are home, or as home as the exile community's descendants will ever be, in a world that does not remember the specific content of the oath they swore, but does remember the institution that swore it. The sword is lost, the skulls are in a tent, the pale man is in the tree, and somewhere in the Stormlands, a young man with the right colouring and the right bearing and a story that may or may not be true is trying to become what the people around him need him to be, which is, in the end, what all of the Blackfyre claimants were always doing, becoming what someone needed them to be, and discovering, one way or another, what the cost of that becoming would turn out to be. The stories will still be here when you wake. They will be here in the morning, in the afternoon, in the years ahead. The same stories, the same questions, the same old argument about what it takes to be a rightful ruler in a world that disagrees about what rightful means. You do not need to resolve any of it tonight. You do not need to hold any of it. The only thing required of you right now is to let go of the history, of the questions, of the weight of 8 centuries of consequence, of the specific gravity of a story this old and this full of human longing and human failure and the specific, irreducible human insistence on continuing. Let it all go quiet. Let the darkness be simple. Let your breathing be the only thing that continues, slow and even and unhurried in the very old dark. And now your watch is ended. The ordinary people who lived through the Blackfyre Rebellions, not the lords and knights whose names fill the histories, but the farmers and craftsmen and servants and innkeepers and sailors whose lives were shaped by the consequences of decisions they had no part in making, are the story's most persistent absence. They are present in the tax records and the grain assessments and the accounts of towns burned and bridges broken and fields that failed to produce because the men who should have been working them were levied into armies. They are present in the specific mathematics of population loss and economic disruption that follow large military engagements in agricultural regions. But they are not present as individuals with perspectives because the records were kept by people who did not consider their perspectives worth preserving. And so what we know of how the Blackfyre Rebellions were experienced by the majority of the people they affected is inferred from the damage rather than recorded from the testimony. The question of what the Blackfyre Rebellions cost the Seven Kingdoms in purely material terms is one that the historians have debated without reaching final agreement, because the records are incomplete and the baseline against which the damage must be measured is itself uncertain. What can be said with confidence is that the first rebellion alone, which involved armies of tens of thousands of men and the decisive engagement of the Redgrass Field and its aftermath of attainted estates and political restructuring, produced disruptions to the agricultural and commercial life of the affected regions that were still visible in the economic records decades later. The subsequent rebellions added to this accumulation in different ways. The third and fourth were primarily the disruptions of invasion and campaign rather than internal civil conflict, but invasion and campaign exact their own specific costs. The total weight of what the Blackfyre question cost, spread across a century, is enormous and largely uncounted. The Targaryen dynasty survived the Blackfyre Rebellions. This is the most basic fact, and it is easy to state and easy to underestimate because survival looks like the natural state of things that have survived, and the most difficult achievement seems like the one that almost happened rather than the one that did. But the dynasty that emerged from the century of rebellion was not the same dynasty that had entered it. It had been tested in ways that the previous century had not demanded. It had been required to answer questions about its own legitimacy that it would have preferred not to be asked. It had won those answers at the cost of wars and methods and political compromises that left marks on the institution that were not entirely invisible even in the age of the Great Winter. The Blackfyre question did not break the dynasty. It changed it. And the dynasty it produced, changed, was the one that Robert Baratheon's rebellion would eventually encounter and overthrow. There is a thread that connects the Blackfyre Rebellions to the long night that looms over the age of the Great Winter, and it is not a thread of military history or dynastic politics. It is a thread of attention, of what a civilization was looking at during the century when the others were presumably still there, beyond the wall in the cold north, watching and waiting with the patience of things that are not constrained by the human lifespans in which human attention operates. While the Seven Kingdoms fought 5 civil wars over the question of which Targaryen should sit the Iron Throne, the real threat to the realm's existence was accumulating in the places that no one with power was looking at. The Night's Watch, depleted and underfunded and regarded as a dumping ground for criminals and failures, was keeping the wall. Bloodraven was beyond it, becoming something that could see the long night coming. The rest of the realm was looking at each other. If this journey through 1,000 years of fire and grief settled something in you tonight, consider subscribing. The history continues, and so does this channel because of you. If you watch this through to the end, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? And if you have a piece of lore you'd like us to follow next, leave it in the comments. The Citadel's archives are very large. We have plenty of candles left.